The Ediacaran takes its name from the hills of Ediacara, where rock formations were first attributed to the Ediacaran geological period. The Ediacaran took place between the Precambrian supereon and the Phanerozoic eon. It should be noted that the Ediacaran is sometimes called the late Neoproterozoic, being the last period of the Neoproterozoic, literally the era before animals. It was a unique and relatively long pivotal epoch in geological time. With around 94 million years of existence, the Ediacaran stands out from the inertia of earlier life in terms of geology and paleontology. It put an end to the Precambrian eon to mark the beginning of an incredibly rich period in the world of living things. This period saw the birth and extinction of the oldest known complex multicellular organisms. It was, in fact, the first mass extinction in Earth's history. This is why it is generally subdivided into two parts in the timescale: the lower Ediacaran and the upper Ediacaran. Note that this subdivision varies slightly, depending on the geographic region studied. The lower Ediacaran, corresponding to the first part of the Ediacaran period, began around -635 million years BC and immediately played an essential role in the development of life on planet Earth. The late Ediacaran, on the other hand, represents the second part of this period and spans roughly between 580 and -541 million years ago, marking the end of the Ediacaran. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and see how the Ediacaran began. The only creatures in existence before the Ediacaran were unicellular and static. In other words, algae and cyanobacteria, photosynthetic organisms. These tiny creatures occupied the oceans and thrived without the need for oxygen. But how were the first complex creatures formed? How did the transition from the static microbes of the Precambrian to the fauna of the Ediacara? In fact, it would seem that life eventually found its way in while the Earth was facing a major climatic crisis. When we speak of a unified Earth and a supercontinent, we usually mean Pangea, but the continents have only linked and unlinked over billions of years. Pangea was not the first supercontinent to form. At the very beginning of the Mesoproterozoic, a supercontinent called Columbia began to break up 1.6 billion years ago. Over time, the supercontinent Rodinia formed around 1.1 billion years ago. Fast forward a little further to the end of the Tonian, 750 billion years ago. The continent of Rodinia, under the effect of hotspots, is pierced by magma spears. They pierce the Earth's crust and spew out huge quantities of lava. The ground then began to fracture. This event was accompanied by the opening of oceans and inlets, which increased the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, and hence rainfall. The carbon present in the rain, in the form of carbon dioxide, soon found its way back into the ocean, trapped in sediments in the form of carbonates. At the same time, the enormous lava flows produced by the Rodinia fracture formed basaltic surfaces on the surface of the continents. When eroded by moisture, these basaltic surfaces consume 8 times more carbon than the same granitic surface. Over millions of years, atmospheric CO2, a greenhouse gas, decreases drastically. the Earth enters a new period of extreme cold, 30 million years after the start of the fragmentation of Rodinia. The Tonian ends and the Cryogenian begins. Our planet underwent not one but two ice ages during this period. Prior to the Ediacaran, the Earth had undergone successive episodes of glaciation, the most important of which was the Huronian glaciation, extending to the equator between minus 2.4 billion years ago and minus 2.1 billion years ago, and earning it the nickname Snowball Earth. As the Ediacaran approached more than 720 million years ago, the planet underwent a new period of planetary glaciation, with immense ice caps stretching across the globe. Rock analyses show a significant reduction in carbon content and hence in organic activity. Photosynthesis was also cut off over millions of years. Bacteria have therefore suffered the full force of this glacial chaos. The ice cap could be heard hundreds of meters below the surface. At times, temperatures dropped as low as minus 50 degrees Celsius or minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Many bacteria did not survive, and the first algae probably also lost a significant number of specimens during this period of extreme cold. Yet snatches of life seem to have found refuges to survive this difficult period. One might think that this glaciation dealt a fatal blow to the evolution and expansion of life on Earth, but it would be a mistake to stop at this preconceived idea. Life is an eternal adaptation. That's what evolution is all about. Look at this little organism. It's a trichoplax. At first glance, it doesn't look like a highly evolved creature. Barely visible to the naked eye, it looks like a large amoeba. It's a placozoan. It belongs to the group of organisms known as metazoans. Placozoans are ultimately metazoans with a particularly simple structure. Trichoplax has no head, tail, legs, or nervous system. It has no digestive tract, nor does it have extracellular digestion. It's hard to see how it can survive and qualify as a living organism. Yet it has a body covered with cilia, which it uses to move around. Its shape is rather unusual, and we know very little about it. But if we delve a little deeper, we might find that Trichoplax has only 4 different cell types. This confirms its place among simple organisms. And yet, this little animal, along with others of its kind, has undoubtedly played an extremely important role in evolution. This little body contains the protein genes that enable the antero-posterior, dorso-ventral axes, and even 4 of the visual pigment genes. Imagine such a simple primitive animal is one of the keys to the evolution of living things. It's not alone in this environment, since after the ice ages, algae developed extensively and spread throughout the world's oceans. Underwater waters became more vegetated. This intense glaciation, known as the Varanger glaciation, lasted 85 million years and ended 635 million years ago. This marked the end of the Cryogenian and the beginning of the Ediacaran. Rodinia was an immense supercontinent comprising North America, South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, India, Siberia, and other regions. All were grouped together in a single landmass. With such a configuration, the landmasses were clustered near the poles, which would have contributed to intensified climatic cooling and larger ice caps. Furthermore, the relationship between the Ediacaran period and the supercontinent Rodinia is very close, although to pave the way for the Ediacaran, the supercontinent had to fracture into 8 pieces 750 million years ago. By the time of the Ediacaran, Rodinia had already been fracturing for almost 120 million years. And if you remember, Ediacaran fossils have been found in regions that are currently far apart, such as Australia, England, and Namibia. Since Rodinia was already fragmented, Ediacaran animals from 600 million years ago could not have traveled such great distances. They potentially lived on the margins of a single continent, Pannotia. A hypothetical supercontinent that emerged from the fragmentation of Rodinia and would have existed from 600 to 540 million years ago. At the dawn of the Ediacaran, cold and ice gave way to a warmer climate. This rapid transition coincided with a significant increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide, which probably led to abrupt warming. The presence of ash, basalt, and other volcanic rock deposits on the Ediacaran group supports the idea that potential volcanic eruptions occurred and contributed to the emission of greenhouse gases, which would explain the high presence of carbon dioxide. Following these events, the atmosphere was rich in carbon dioxide, which would have led to the gradual thawing of the Earth, thanks to the greenhouse effect. As a result, the melted ice caps and glaciers would have flowed into the ocean water, causing the sea levels of the time to rise. And since temperatures were warmer, the oceans would have undergone evaporation, which logically generated humidity in the atmosphere. Contrary to appearances, this climatic catastrophe was a godsend. It led to a major diversification of living organisms. When the thaw starts, a whole chain of reactions ensues. The erosion of continents as the ice melts is said to be responsible for the release of vast quantities of nutrients. This abundance of nutrients encourages the expansion and proliferation of phytoplankton. These Precambrian cyanobacteria, operating through the mechanism of photosynthesis, transformed light energy into chemical energy. They stored light in glucose, an energy-generating substance for later use. Gradually, anaerobic microorganisms began to absorb carbon dioxide and produce oxygen in the atmosphere, releasing large quantities of oxygen into the atmosphere. At that time, life was still confined to water. The molecules that make up living matter are photosensitive. They could be destroyed if subjected to certain types of radiation, notably ultraviolet. 600 million years ago, thanks to the significant release of oxygen into the air, ozone was formed and accumulated naturally in the stratosphere. This molecule, composed of 3 oxygen atoms, O3, absorbs ultraviolet rays, protecting living organisms from their harmful effects. At this point, the ozone layer's first concentration threshold is reached, heading to an explosion in marine diversity. Ozone is favorable to the development of life above 15 kilometers or 9 miles altitude, but it is particularly oxidizing and dangerous in the air around us. All these events culminated 575 million years ago in the Avalon explosion. Moisture and increased oxygen levels encouraged the development of the first complex life forms, creating a marine ecosystem and a natural habitat conducive to biodiversity. New multicellular organisms with aerobic respiration mechanisms replaced single-cell microbes. It was at this point that the major event of the Ediacaran era took place, the Avalon explosion, or Ediacaran explosion, characterized by the emergence of mobile creatures that roam the oceans before dying out forever. But between their first appearance and their extinction, a whole new life had manifested itself. The remains of the Avalon explosion can be seen in Newfoundland, where an ancient fossil site suggests that multicellular organisms were living 50 kilometers or 30 miles away at the time. This site illustrates the evolutionary radiation that took place around 575 million years ago, marked by rapid morphological diversification in complex macroscopic multicellular organisms, referred to as the Ediacaran fauna. In this period, Neoproterozoic microorganisms contributed to the development and diversification of life on Earth by progressively oxygenating the atmosphere. In return, the increase in oxygen levels favored the development of new, more complex organisms. This evolution took place in two stages, in parallel with the formation of the ozone layer. Life before the formation of the ozone layer was subject to intense exposure to the sun's harmful X-rays and ultraviolet rays. These UV rays, particularly intense and unfiltered, can damage organic molecules, notably DNA. This DNA damage can lead to mutations, cell dysfunction, and even the death of organisms. In such an environment, life would have found it difficult to develop complex structures and evolve beyond simple forms. So for a long time, life on Earth remained primitive, limited mainly to single-cell microorganisms that could survive despite these extreme conditions. But with the gradual formation of the ozone layer, which was not yet fully filtered, the nascent organisms faced challenges inherent in their development. For this reason, some Ediacaran specimens have been observed to be carpet or leaf-shaped. However, around 600 million years ago, the situation began to change. As oxygen levels in the atmosphere rose, a stable ozone layer began to form, offering vital protection against UV radiation. This created a window of opportunity for life. With the UV threat largely eliminated, life was able to explore new evolutionary pathways, leading to increased diversity and complexity. It's important to remember that Ediacaran animals were not as developed and complex as today's animals such as fish, insects, or the more ancient dinosaurs. Ediacaran fauna included organisms that bore no resemblance to any modern animal. Generally speaking, they were multicellular creatures of varying sizes. To this day, their classification remains a matter of debate. Strictly speaking, they cannot be defined as animals, but they certainly represent the first complex living beings to form on planet Earth. Be that as it may, the Ediacaran ecosystem has witnessed the emergence of a variety of specimens with highly diversified diets and lifestyles. The fauna of the Ediacaran lived exclusively in the ocean, as the ozone layer was not yet thick enough to allow life on land. For this, we'd have to wait almost 200 million years for the first plants to emerge from the water at minus 450 million years, and several tens of millions more to see the first land animals. For the time being, life consists of large and varied multicellular creatures. Unlike Precambrian organisms, which were static, microscopic in size, and lacking in diversity, these new creatures would have developed in the Prototethys Ocean, which formed during the Neoproterozoic, following the fragmentation of the ancient supercontinent Rodinia. During the Ediacaran, this ocean occupied a central position, dividing the continental fragments that would later give rise to future continents, such as Laurentia and Baltica. The Prototethys Ocean stretched from the south to the north of Gondwana, formed during the Ediacaran and containing the continents of today: Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, part of North America, and India. This is why Gondwana is also considered a supercontinent. Now that we have a glimpse of the environment that welcomed the first Ediacaran creatures, let's take a look at their appearance. Some fossils resemble jellyfish, while others are impossible to classify among the biological groups we know. In any case, most Ediacaran fossils were disc-frond or feather-shaped. Some Ediacaran fauna are even referred to as Ediacaran feathers. Other creatures are oval-shaped. All in all, most Ediacaran organisms were soft, flat, and lacked a hard external skeleton, making their preservation relatively rare, as it contains unfossilized fossils. This may seem paradoxical, but it's true. The concept of traditional fossilization is defined by the preservation of hard bodies, shells, bones, etc., in mineral stones, such as amber or any other organic material. However, the Ediacaran fossils were soft and boneless, making them difficult to preserve. The fossils found were wrapped in a thin film of organic matter, less than 3 micrometers thick. That said, the sedimentary layers overlaying Ediacaran creatures often contain the presence of biofilms. This suggests that the organic film preserving Ediacaran organisms may have been formed through the contribution of microbial biofilms. Colonies of bacteria, algae, fungi, and other types of small unicellular organisms probably secreted substances that stuck to sand and mud to form a kind of carpet on the seabed surface. We can then assume that Ediacaran organisms lived under or around these biofilms. And when some of the Ediacaran organisms died, their remains fell to the seabed, where they were gradually covered by sedimentary particles stuck together by the biofilms. Over time, the sedimentary layers containing the fossils of the Ediacaran organisms and the fossilized biofilms gradually compacted. Under the pressure of the upper layers, these sediments turned into rock, preserving the organisms inside these rock formations. To recapitulate, biofilms did not directly cover Ediacaran organisms, but they did play an environmental role by stabilizing marine sediments and providing an environment conducive to the preservation of Ediacaran faunal footprints. As they would have undergone rapid fossilization in fine sediments rich in specific minerals, their state of preservation is almost miraculous, which is why the Ediacaran fauna is so fascinating. Now that we know a little more about the preservation characteristics of Ediacaran faunal remains, let's get to know the most emblematic animals of the Ediacara biota. Let's start with the first Ediacaran fossil found in Charnwood Forest, the Charnia. The discovery of the Charnia is exceptional in that it paved the way for studies of Ediacaran creatures, thanks to which we know how they contributed to the creation of today's world. Charnia was a marine organism living on the ocean floor. It is described as a branched organism given its tree-like structure. This arborescent organism had a form of fronds that propagated in the same way as branches. In fact, it is one of the fossils known as the Ediacara feathers. Fossil records indicate that Charnia masoni could extend over several tens of centimeters or inch, but other Charnia specimens vary widely in size. Like Charnia, Swartpuntia also belongs to the Ediacaran leaf family. These fossils form two groups: the fractal-shaped rangimorphs and the simpler Ernietomorphs. Generally speaking, Swartpuntia have a fleecy appearance, rather like an inflatable mattress, and are on average between 5 and 20 centimeters long, or around 4 inches. Like Charnia fronds, aspidella discs have been found in many geological formations around the world, dating back to the Ediacaran period, and are among the most emblematic groups of Ediacaran fauna. Let's continue our tour to discover the aspidella. The aspidella is characterized by its disc or cup shape. It has a slightly depressed center and raised edges. In addition, aspidella discs range from a few millimeters to several centimeters in diameter. Like Charnia and aspidella, Dickinsonia is also one of the earliest fossils discovered, notably in the Ediacaran deposits of Siberia's White Sea. It was a rather flat, oval-shaped organism. It could sometimes take the shape of a disc, a tire, or even resemble a carpet. Like the Charnia, the Dickinsonia could extend to several dozen centimeters in length. Sprigina is also found. Fossils of this species have been found in Australia and Russia. That said, the Sprigina was a small organism. It had an elongated, sinuous appearance. In fact, its shape is somewhat similar to that of a worm. Just like Eulingia speciformis, another organism discovered in China in 2019 and thought to have lived between 555 and 539 million years BC. This vermiform fossil measures 27 centimeters or 11 inches long and has a well-defined head and tail. It is possible that this organism is the ancestor of bilaterians such as insects, mollusks, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and so on. Most importantly, Eulingia speciformis bears a striking resemblance to animals that appeared in the Cambrian. Was the Cambrian explosion less sudden than most fossils suggest? Only time will tell. Finally, fossils of another soft organism have also been discovered, this time exclusively in Russia. These are the fossils of Kimberella, an oval creature that resembles a slug or gastropod and is sometimes associated with mollusks. Fossils of this creature are often incomplete. It is therefore difficult to determine its exact size, but it is estimated that Kimberella could have been a few millimeters long. The fossil samples found indicate that the Ediacaran fauna included for the most part rancomorphs and fronds among the dozens of groups identified. this may seem a meager collection, but the presence of arboreal, flat and round creatures of varying sizes represents an immense evolution. Let's not forget that before the Ediacaran, organisms were microscopic. In addition to Ediacaran leaves and discs, it's likely that sponges also existed during this period. In fact, a fossil found in Namibia named Otavia appears to have an early form of the sponge. It would have arisen during the Ediacaran, as it was found in the Precambrian geological rocks of Nama. What's more, although it lacks a digestive or nervous system, this organism seems more closely related to animals than to plants or fungi. So it's possible that Otavia is a sponge. However, without further proof, the emergence and evolution of typically Ediacaran sponges remain controversial. Research continues and may provide us with new information on their possible existence in the Ediacaran. Let's turn now to Cladina, a small Ediacaran fossil distinguished by its shells. The organism consists of several interlocking conical shells. And contrary to what you might think, the shells of Cladina species were not made of bone, but of mineral segments. They surrounded the organism, providing support or protection. There's more to come. In 2007, a long silhouette surrounded by a variety of fossils appeared on a sloping rock face at Charnwood. After thorough examination, the 20-centimeter or 8-inch tall creature finally offers some explanation as to its assemblage and position. Luminous in appearance and evoking the idea of a bright light like the aurora borealis, the creature found is named Auroralumia attenboroi and is thought to be around 560 million years old. It is thought to be a precursor of the cnidarians, the group of jellyfish, corals, and anemones. With its flame-like tentacles, Auroralumina resembled an Olympic torch. Moreover, its positioning suggests that it captured its prey using its stinging cells. Finally, Auroralumina is potentially the oldest animal predator known to date. Although Ediacaran organisms are characterized by the absence of skeletons, Auroralumina is the epitome of the great diversity and evolution of the Ediacara biota. It is one of the Ediacaran species with rigid, resistant body structures, probably the primitive forms of skeletons. Doesn't this testify to the diversity, even complexity of the life forms that flourished during the Ediacaran? Proof, too, of the multitude of morphological and anatomical characteristics present in the animal kingdom through the ages. In the Ediacaran, flora was not yet highly developed. Although algae are generally classified as aquatic flora, this classification does not necessarily reflect their true phylogenetic position among living organisms. It's also worth noting that algae existed long before the Ediacaran, since traces of them can be traced back over 3 billion years. On the other hand, some specimens provide an insight into the early diversification of the plant kingdom and the composition of Precambrian ecosystems. Such is the case of the Protocodium sinensis. These 3D preserved fossils were discovered in Shaanxi Province, central China, around 541 million years ago. But this green algae is not a direct ancestor of today's land plants. By the end of the Ediacaran, these organisms had already split off from the branch that would later give rise to land plants. This discovery suggests, however, that this split probably took place earlier than previously thought. Protocodium sines have a central structure made up of tangled tubes and small, tightly packed structures around them, which are similar to the plants, known as Bryopsidales codium. We learn that during the Ediacaran, different groups of organisms suddenly appeared. In addition to being extremely well preserved, the fossils discovered are also extremely varied. So without further ado, let's find out what Ediacaran fossils tell us about life during this period. We'll explore how Ediacaran fauna contributed to the evolution of biodiversity and the creation of a new marine ecosystem. At that time, the vast majority of living creatures lived in shallow seas. Based on the findings of Ediacaran fossils, we can deduce that there was a transitional interval of several million years between the emergence and development of complex organisms. We know that the first Ediacaran organisms were immobile and attached to rocks, shells, marine substrates, and other hard surfaces. Yet we have found traces of nutrients inside their fossils, which means that the Ediacaran fauna was feeding. Being unable to move, Ediacaran sessile organisms drew their food directly from their environment thanks to their feather-like branches. Although they didn't have the same digestive systems as today's animals, we noted that most still had structures similar to a mouth and intestine. Well, except for the Charnia and Swartpuntia, which had none. But let's not forget that the latter were probably the first complex organisms to emerge on Earth. It's logical that they hadn't yet developed such anatomical features at such an early date. Moreover, Charnia and Swartpuntia were probably photosynthetic organisms. They fed on the energy they produced by absorbing sunlight. They may also have filtered organic particles from the water. We note, then, that the first animals had a simple diet, even if their concept of eating a meal differed from ours. And as competitors and predators did not yet exist, at least during most of the Ediacaran, the ocean environment was surely rich in microscopic-sized nutrients, including organic carbon, a nutrient detected on several Ediacaran fossils. In 2018, deposits resembling what could be the first real fossilized meal were found in Russia, in the intestine of Kimberella. After multiple analyses, it turned out that this meal was made up of phytosterol molecules, a substance derived from algae and bacteria present in the ocean during the Ediacaran. It seems that Kimberella fed by scraping and tearing the algae covering the seabed, and seaweed is full of nutrients. This explains why the Ediacara biota was so much larger and more complex than its predecessors. Since Ediacaran fauna fed differently to Precambrian microscopic and unicellular organisms. Now, in 2023, a new study is underway to assess the intestinal content of 3 more Ediacaran fossils from lipids. The information obtained from the lipids preserved in the fossils could provide further clues as to how these animals fed. Indeed, preserved lipid biomarkers offer a unique insight into the biology of fossil organisms. Perhaps we'll soon know more about what animals ate during the Ediacaran. Ediacaran animals are complex, even in their motor skills. Most were fixed to marine substrates, yet signs of movement were revealed. Some fossil footprints found in the hills of Ediacara, and progressively in different parts of the world, visibly include traces of footsteps and movements, probably belonging to organisms developed during the second part of the Ediacaran. These remains tell us about the activity of the Ediacara biota and provide valuable information to better understand the evolution of animals during this period. What's more, we've observed fossil footprints on the sediments that resemble tunnels or excavated paths. If Ediacaran organisms couldn't move, how can we explain the formation of these fossil paths? In addition to tunnels, in 2018, an organism thought to have lived 550 million years ago was found in large numbers in Australia's Nilpena National Park in Ediacara. Resembling a small twisted donut and measuring around 1 centimeter in diameter, the organism has been named Obamas coronatus in honor of former U.S. President Barack Obama. In addition, the Obamas coronatus fossils discovered were surrounded by at least 2 different species. Among the organisms found near Obamas coronatus, we have Tribachidium and Rugoconitis. The Tribachidium and Rugoconitis fossils are also strikingly shaped. They are larger than Obamas coronatus and have triradial symmetry, strange features specific to the Ediacaran fauna. That said, 3 different species were found in the same place. Therefore, some Ediacaran organisms did indeed have the ability to move and reach new areas of the seabed. Incidentally, the Obamas coronatus fossils date back 550 million years, so sessile Ediacaran organisms would indeed have developed the ability to move around in the latter part of this period. What's more, we've seen how Ediacaran animals fed, and we've also learned that they were able to move around. But how can we explain their diversification? How did they reproduce? There are no precise clues as to the mechanism of reproduction in Ediacaran animals, but some fossils have potentially reproductive structures, such as tubular or disc-shaped fossils. It would also seem that some of the organisms had asexual or sexual reproduction methods. However, the question of reproduction is a subject of intense research, opening the field to various interpretations. In-depth studies, or the discovery of more direct data, are needed to obtain precise answers. The Ediacaran had to retain some of its mystery. Like their reproductive methods, we know very little about the ecological interactions between Ediacaran organisms. From the traces we have found, we assume that an ecological system would have existed anyway. Each species seems to have occupied a specific trophic level, and the organisms must have lived in perfect symbiosis. In any case, they didn't eat each other, since they had practically the same food source. Thus, we can see that the Ediacaran biota was characterized by interdependence and an absence of predation between most Ediacaran organisms for most of this period. Well, until the appearance of the aurora lumina. What we know today about the Ediacaran environment and life comes from the interpretation of stratigraphic layers known as the Ediacaran group. This succession of layers is made up of sediments accumulated on the ocean floor at the time. Composed of mudstones, sandstones, and limestones, these sediments have been an invaluable aid to science, enabling us to reconstruct the geological history of the Ediacaran. These sedimentary successions are, to say the least, disconcerting. Each stratum is distinct from the next, both in size and shape. Some layers are horizontal, others inclined or folded. This is probably the impact of tectonic activity on the rocks over time. What's more, the fossilized organisms found in the Ediacaran group were also arranged in different orientations. Their position tells us about their lifestyle, behavior, and ecological interaction during the Ediacaran. And although the Ediacaran period played a major role in the evolution of today's world, the Earth is far from what it was then. This period had distinct geological characteristics compared to today. We've already discussed the factors that contributed to the transition from the primitive world to the beginning of highly organized life. Now let's discover the configuration of the continents and watersheds that existed during the Ediacaran. As we have already learned, the supercontinent Pannotia was formed by the fragmentation of Rodinia as a result of various geological processes. But its existence was short-lived, and it too began to fragment. As with Rodinia, the continental masses of Pannotia fragmented and dispersed, following their own trajectory, due in part to the opening of an ocean called Iapetus. Some Pannonian landmasses ended up in the Earth's southern hemisphere, while others moved to other parts of the globe. Tectonic activity, erosion, and sediment accumulation, and the formation of the first continental shelves. The sedimentary deposits of the Ediacaran period exerted pressure on the older sedimentary layers below. This played a role in the construction of the new landmasses. Gradually, the sedimentary basins were filled with deposits of minerals, organic debris, and fossils, and transformed into rock layers, compacting and lithifying. While these continental rocks were thickening, the continents were melting, leading to the closure of eventual oceans, such as the pre-Ediacaran Prototethys Ocean. After the breakup of the supercontinents Rodinia and Pannotia, a huge landmass emerged called Gondwana, following a series of orogenic events, including the Pan-African orogeny around 600 million years ago. As a reminder, Gondwana encompassed vast land masses, including what are today Africa, Antarctica, South America, Australia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula. At the same time, emerging platforms had transformed landscapes and provided habitats conducive to the growth and flourishing of life, especially marine life. The dispersal of the Pannonian landmasses contributed to the Earth's changing geological and geographical configuration during the Ediacaran period. Huge expanses of water, probably oceans, now covered most of the planet, and water currents were impacted. All we know is that the bodies of water were shallow and rich in nutrients. The seabed was covered with organic matter, the thickness of which varied from zone to zone, and they would have been warmer than today's oceans. The configuration of the continents was also constantly changing during the Ediacaran. As tectonic processes progressed, the dislocated and dispersed landmasses of the supercontinents gave rise to new continents and at least one ocean. The Mirovia Ocean surrounded the supercontinent Rodinia and would have preceded the formation of the Pan-African Ocean. This in turn gave way to the Panthalassa Ocean. But we're not there yet. It was in this ocean that Ediacaran organisms appeared around 600 million years ago. The Ediacaran is known for its coastal environments and lagoons in shallow areas of the ocean. It is also possible that seas or small marine basins coexisted in parallel at this time. Whatever the case, the ocean waters of the Ediacaran were different from those of today. In fact, these waters had the same characteristics as those of the epicontinental seas, with chemical composition specific to the Ediacaran. In other words, they were shallow and low in oxygen compared with today's levels. Finally, Merovia, being the only known ocean of the early Ediacaran after the closure of Prototethys and before the appearance of Lapithus, probably surrounded the continental fragments of Rodinia and Pannotia. In this sense, its size would have been immense, covering a large part of the Earth's surface. But not for long. The ocean's configuration then depended on the shape of the land masses emerging as a result of tectonic movements. Moreover, the continued presence of the Merovia Ocean is uncertain. It is possible that the Merovia Ocean disappeared over time due to geological processes, or that it was subducted beneath a possible continental plate. To date, it is difficult to draw definite conclusions about the fate of the Merovia Ocean. Due to plate tectonics, the Earth had to undergo multiple active geological processes during the Ediacaran before taking on the shape we know today, starting with rifting and the formation of sedimentary basins. The Ediacaran period saw several episodes of rifting on both sides of the globe. This involved continental fracturing, a process in which the Earth's crust cracks, creating collapsed trenches. As a result of tectonic movements, the continental shelves would have drifted apart. As a result, the Angara Basin was formed at the level of the East Siberian Sea. This was followed by another rifting event in the Adelaide Basin in South Australia. These basins contain extensive sedimentary deposits, providing us with information on the environmental and geological conditions of the Ediacaran period. Finally, volcanic traces have also been found in the fossil footprints, suggesting that volcanoes skirted the rifting zones, releasing magma that would have risen and solidified. In this way, submarine mountain ranges would have formed as the plates separated, reshaping the configuration of the planet and seabed. The early Ediacaran would have seen 3 supercontinents. Rodinia was already in the process of breaking up. Pannotia was in place for a short time, and Gondwana fragmented. While Rodinia and Pannotia were in the process of fragmenting, Gondwana, on the other hand, developed during the Ediacaran period, i.e., between the end of the Neoproterozoic and the beginning of the Paleozoic. From there, this supercontinent, like its predecessors, gradually broke up into several landmasses. As a result, 3 Ediacaran continents were formed: Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia. Incidentally, there were probably other smaller terrestrial fragments, but we know no more about them. In any case, we do know that the Ediacaran witnessed the fragmentation of 3 supercontinents and the evolution of at least 3 distinct continents. It should be noted that the formation of these new continents did not take place with any regular frequency. The principle has been the same since the dawn of time, with the separation of Earth's crust occurring as a result of tectonic movements, whether plate divergence, platform collision, or rifting. In any case, the creation of continents has always been a continuous process. Some continents break up, others form and evolve over time. It's also worth noting that the formation of the three Ediacaran continents set the stage for future major events, including the Cambrian explosion. During the Ediacaran, the Laurentia continent was located in the northern hemisphere. It played an important role in the creation of North America, corresponding to Canada and the United States. Gradually, other continents formed around Laurentia. It's worth noting that the hypothetical ocean Moravia potentially lay to the east of the Laurentia continent, separating it from the other landmasses forming at the time. The second continent formed during the Ediacaran is the Baltica continent. This included the northern regions of Europe, including Scandinavia and parts of Russia. The third continent, Siberia, is also known as the Angara Craton. During the Ediacaran period, it encompassed Siberia and Russia, and was positioned to the east of the two continents, Laurentia and Baltica. In addition, following the fragmentation of the supercontinents, the Iapetus Ocean was formed, separating Baltica from the two continents of Laurentia and Siberia. Influenced by geological processes such as tectonic shifts and continental collisions, Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia all contributed to the creation of terrestrial landscapes and the diversification of biological environments, both during and after the Ediacaran. In addition to these three continents, geological research suggests the existence of other landmasses during the Ediacaran. And as this is a very early period, the lack of further evidence means that until now, we have no further details as to their position or size. However, they would probably have been smaller, based on tectonic models, fossil analyses, and the rocks used for geological studies. In any case, geological and paleontological research continues apace, regularly revealing new information and enriching our knowledge of past eras. And we're certainly not immune to new fossil discoveries. We'll certainly know more in the near future about the complete configuration of continents and landmasses during and at the end of the Ediacaran. The three continents mentioned above were also involved in other tectonic movements during the Ediacaran. In addition to rifting, the Earth underwent other geological processes, including a series of orogenic events. Orogeny is the reverse process of rifting, corresponding to the creation of mountains as a result of the uplift of the Earth's crust and the movement of tectonic plates. Like the Appalachian Mountains, which were formed around 400 million years ago, after the Ediacaran, following subduction of the Proto-Tethys Ocean. In any case, during the Ediacaran, the Appalachian mountain range did not yet have its present configuration. At the time, these mountains constituted the margins of the separate Rodinia continent, for the reasons given above. Just before the Ediacaran, a series of orogenic events took place, giving rise to the supercontinent of Gondwana and Pannotia around 600 million years ago. This is the Pan-African orogeny that gave rise to the Pan-African mountain range, the great orogenic system of all Africa and beyond. To cite a few examples of orogenesis during the Ediacaran, the Catamonian orogeny, which took place between 650 and 550 million years BC, was only a short segment of the immense Pan-African chain. A Paleozoic terrain would then have subducted beneath the Gondwana supercontinent, triggering the Cadomian orogeny that can be seen on buried rocks all over southern Britain. Between 600 and 500 million years BC, South Australia also underwent tectonic activity, triggering the Adelaide orogeny, which also gave rise to mountains and basins. Other orogenic events then occurred on the southern and eastern margins of another Ediacaran continent, Laurentia. These include the Kyberan orogeny in Africa and the Susso-Norwegian orogeny in Western Europe. Last but not least, Baltica was also affected by tectonic movements that paved the way for later orogenies, the best known of which is the Caledonian orogeny, leading to the formation of the mountain chain of the same name at the beginning of the Cambrian. In short, the environment of the time would have been influenced by the division of Rodinia, Pannotia, and Gondwana, modifying the landscape and climate. The dislocation of the continents had thus favored the emergence of the Ediacaran and the diversification of its organisms. Then, the tables turned during the latter part of the Ediacaran. In fact, the Nama geological series shows that between minus 550 and minus 541 million years BC, over 80% of the Ediacaran fauna had unexpectedly died out. The discovery of the Ediacaran fauna was essential in identifying the origin of our world. Thanks to traces dating back hundreds of millions of years, we have been able to reconstruct the Earth's history and discover all the events that have, in one way or another, shaped our present. Yet here we are, at the end of the Ediacaran, a geological period that spanned 94 million years. An exciting era marked by the development of the first complex organisms. While the early Ediacaran was marked by the development of the first complex organisms, it was only at the end of this period that these organisms changed and took on more complex forms before becoming extinct. The Earth has experienced several episodes of mass extinction over the course of its history, involving a considerable loss of biodiversity and impacting the evolution of life forms on Earth. The exact number of mass extinctions is still a matter of debate, but we currently count 5 major mass extinctions. These are the Ordovician Silurian extinction, occurred around 443 million years ago, the Devonian extinction, around 359 million years ago, Permian-Triassic extinction, about 252 million years ago, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, occurred around 201 million years ago, and the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, occurred around 66 million years ago. Finally, with the discovery of the Ediacaran, we learn that there is a 6th, which in turn turns out to be the first. The Ediacaran extinction was recently identified as the first biological crisis of all time, adding to the 5 previously mentioned extinctions. As a result, the Ediacaran fauna disappeared, fortunately leaving traces behind, but alas, almost no descendants. Then, around 541 million years ago, due to a drastic decline in biodiversity, between 80 and 95% of Ediacaran organisms became extinct. It is thought that Yellingia speciformis may have been part of the minority that survived, having appeared 10 million years before the Cambrian and resembling Cambrian organisms to boot. In any case, isn't it strange to see the majority of Ediacaran species become extinct overnight? What's more mysterious are the causes of this extinction. which remain to this day uncertain. Ultimately, the disappearance of the Ediacaran fauna is as enigmatic as its appearance. The Ediacaran extinction, also known as the Ediacaran Cambrian extinction, is a major event that shook up the story of life on Earth and challenged our understanding of the evolution of the animal kingdom. Moreover, this biological crisis can be attributed to various types of change. The precise causes of the end of the Ediacaran remain a matter of debate. That said, it would appear that environmental and climatic changes are the most plausible causes. The Ediacaran was marked by several cycles of climatic cooling and warming, impacted by changes in the Earth's orbit. Such fluctuations would probably have been detrimental to animal life at the time. For example, by disrupting survival and nutrient availability, among other things. Let's not forget that Ediacaran organisms were the first living beings. They would have been particularly sensitive and not really adapted to cataclysmic changes. On the other hand, the Ediacaran period saw several intense volcanic eruptions, with the formation and fracturing of various supercontinents. This volcanic activity could also have played a role in the extinction of Ediacaran fauna. Volcanoes release large quantities of gases into the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. When these gases come into contact with water, they are transformed into sulfuric acid. It is therefore assumed that by invading the oceans it would have affected marine organisms. In addition to contaminating ocean waters, volcanic fumes can also prevent sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface, leading to global cooling. In this respect, traces of glaciation indicate that a second climate crisis occurred towards the end of the Ediacaran. From beginning to end, the Ediacaran was marked by extreme conditions. The beginning of the Ediacaran bears the imprint of global warming, while its end experienced a dramatic cooling episode. But global warming did have a positive effect on the planet. It has greatly contributed to the evolution of life on Earth. On the other hand, the episode of glaciation, due to the drastic drop in atmospheric temperatures, was catastrophic to say the least. During the lower Ediacaran, temperatures averaged between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, 68 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. On the other hand, the second part of the Ediacaran would have had the opposite effect. Temperatures would have plummeted between 0 degrees Celsius and minus 20 degrees Celsius, or dropped between 32 and minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the area. The spread of carbon dioxide had certainly altered the chemical composition of the atmosphere. But incessant tectonic movements in the interaction between ocean and atmosphere could also have contributed to the second Ediacaran climate crisis. Then, 579 million years ago, a period of cooling, even extreme glaciation occurred, namely the Great Gas Gears glaciation. This period of glaciation was so intense that ice caps formed in certain regions. Deposits of sediment and rock left behind by glaciers, probably still developing, have been discovered in the polar regions. In Canada, at gas gears in particular, a dropstone-rich layer 300 meters to 1,000 feet thick can be seen beneath some Ediacaran fossils, reflecting this possible environmental change. Glacial moraine deposits have also been discovered on 8 separate paleocontinents, in areas adjacent to the poles, and at latitudes around 30 degrees to 10 degrees from the equator. With the drastic drop in temperatures, glaciers would have trapped considerable quantities of ocean water in the form of ice, lowering sea levels. As a result, the glaciation episode would have impacted the natural habitats of Ediacaran fauna. By reducing ocean water levels to their lowest levels. Moreover, it seems that between the two Ediacaran climatic crises, this geological period experienced numerous climatic fluctuations, with rain or snowfall depending on the region studied. Some localities would have observed abundant precipitation, to the point of seeing lakes, rivers, and deltas created, while other areas would have recorded arid conditions. The Gaskier's glaciation was probably on a grand scale, but not to the extent of causing another snowball Earth event. Yet this ultimate climatic shift would be the most likely cause of the end of the Ediacaran. Most Ediacaran organisms would never have withstood such bitter cold, especially as all Ediacaran creatures were born and raised in a tropical climate. That said, we also found that oxygen levels were not stable at the end of the Ediacaran. Following glaciation, the number of oxygen-producing organisms decreased. However, during the early-late Ediacaran, oxygen levels were higher than during the late Ediacaran, but it wasn't increased oxygenation that closed the curtain on this geological period. As it happens, a hypoxic environment prevailed at the end of the Ediacaran, meaning that oxygen levels were once again low, just as they were at the beginning. Given that Ediacaran organisms were all aerobic, not receiving the necessary oxygen supply could have been fatal. Finally, there is no evidence for a total absence of oxygen at the end of the Ediacaran, apart from the fact that certain sedimentary rocks observed in southern China were surrounded by zones rich in iron, but considerably lacking in oxygen. That's why we prefer to use the term hypoxic rather than anoxic. Be that as it may, some of the minority of Ediacaran survivors were larger, notably the fronds, whose size also reflects a potential drop in oxygen in the water. The larger surface area of the fronds would have enabled them to survive in such harsh conditions. In other words, some organisms would have adapted to the lack of oxygen in order to thrive, developing a maximum proportion of cells in direct contact with seawater. On the other hand, some marine organisms are said to have gradually transformed themselves into predators, as illustrated by the behavior of the Aurora lumina, or the Kimberella, which displays characteristics similar to those of a grazer. It is assumed that it disrupted the microbial substrate to feed on defenseless Ediacaran organisms and surrounding biofilms. Moreover, primitive predators employing a variety of means to feed also use perforation as a method of hunting. In fact, we have found traces of drilling on Claudina shells. It is therefore plausible that the appearance of the first animal predators would have endangered the lives of the Ediacaran survivors, most of whom were sessile, non-predatory species. Perhaps the Ediacaran became extinct as a result of tectonic upheaval. The Earth has not remained the same over the eons, but it has always been subject to the same rules. It never stops moving, undergoing inevitable geological changes over time. By undergoing frequent environmental changes, it is likely that the Earth would eventually have reached the limits of its resilience. Recurrent and relentless plate tectonics might well have tested the biodiversity and ecosystems of this fascinating period in the history of life. Thus, fluctuating oxygen levels, climatic variations, and geological movements are likely factors in the Ediacaran extinction. Nevertheless, scientific research into the Ediacaran continues, and new discoveries may soon be made. In the center of Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia, an ocean called Iapetus forms. In its shallows, animal life explodes. Most were soft-bodied animals such as worms and sponges, but there were also the first arthropods, distant ancestors of today's insects and crustaceans, ancestors of future cephalopods, as well as animals that had no descendants. They all evolved on the ocean floor. This new fauna now possesses internal and external organs such as eyes, legs, digestive system, antennae, mouth apparatus. A food chain now exists. Microorganisms such as trilobites form the bottom of this chain, and at the very top is a super predator, Anomalocaris. Anomalocaris is a genus of arthropods and the first known predator in the history of life. Its distinctive feature is its large, complete visual organs, compound eyes. 2 to 3 centimeters or 1 inch long, they have 16,000 facets. Its eyesight, though primitive, enables it to distinguish potential prey, which is already a formidable evolutionary asset. Its long, narrow body measures less than a meter. It is covered by a mineral-free exoskeleton and possesses a toothy mouth, flexible legs, and a long V-shaped tail, which must have enabled it to propel itself swiftly through the water. Its 28 lateral fins are arranged in pairs. Alongside him are many other animals, each more original than the last. Less spectacular in terms of size, Hallucinogea sparsa has a long, slender, worm-like body, measuring up to 3 centimeters or 1 inch. A predatory ancestor of cephalopods, Nectocaris pteryx, is described as having a head with 2 eyes, 1 or 2 pairs of appendages, and an oval carapace at the rear. But the specimen that really catches our attention is the famous pangea, a species of worm or eel just a few centimeters long. Its protodorsal spine suggests that it was the first animal of the chordate phylum, or even the precursor of the vertebrate branch. Today, however, there is no unanimity on this last point. This animal has a chord, a primitive spinal column running the length of the animal. It is from this chord that the muscles and organs that make up the animal are assembled. In the space of a few million years, all the pieces needed for the great adventure of the evolution of the animal world were in place. This Cambrian explosion was halted at the end of the period by an extinction caused by glaciation and a sudden change in temperature. Nearly 40% of species became extinct. Although ecological niches were left vacant, they were rapidly taken over by surviving species during the Ordovician period, leading to evolutionary radiation. Glaciation lowered sea levels and increased the number of shoals. The surviving species multiply, and although the ocean is calmer, it soon becomes populated by animals of all kinds. The families and genera of marine organisms multiply. This is the event of the Great Ordovician biodiversification. The rapid diversification of plankton favored the development of marine fauna living on the ocean floor. Crinoids, bivalve brachiopods, and trilobites multiply, but new arrivals also develop. Corals colonize the oceans and build coral reefs. They enrich the marine fauna. Land seems lifeless, and yet, on closer inspection, a few lichens are beginning to set their sights on it. A lichen is a fungus associated with an algae that grows where no plant can live. The fungus and the algae live in a symbiotic relationship, rather like coral. The fungus protects the algae. It protects it with water and mineral salts. The algae produces sugars and other products that it shares with the fungus. They can be found on rocks by the sea or on cooled lava. At first sight, nothing very extraordinary, and yet, when they rot, lichens leave debris that forms a soil rich enough for moss and other plants to grow. The ground is slowly prepared. The tiny advance of life on Earth is about to be halted by a mass extinction. Glaciation sets in, wiping out many species and slowing down the momentum that some life forms were beginning to build up out of the water. The ocean, once teeming with life, is now calm. Many families, genera, and species of animals and plants have disappeared. There's a kind of void, but nature hastened to fill it, and the surviving species underwent an evolutionary radiation. The continents continue to move. Siberia, Baltica, and Laurentia, which had formed a mega-archipelago, moved closer to Proto-Gondwana. Over time, they formed the supercontinent Laurasia. The collision of these lands gave rise to a gigantic mountain range, the Caledonian Chain. Then the ice began to melt. Ocean levels rise, and certain species develop considerably. With the ice cap gone, the climate becomes mild again, with temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. What about the mainland? We find the lichens that were already starting to appear before the extinction. The first mosses are now appearing, and the flora will begin to establish itself out of the water. While life abounded in the depths of the sea, the landscape on land at the time consisted of bare, windswept rock as far as the eye could see. Then, as they pass, high and low tides leave sediments at the water's edge. This sediment is the first holdfast for plant life. The oldest known trace of primitive plants is that of Cooksonia. High and low tides and the consequent alternation between the passage of water and the drying out of the water allow the flora to gradually become accustomed to life outside the water. Cooksonia plants grow to less than 10 centimeters in height and have a relatively simple structure. They have no leaves or flowers, only a stem that divides into several branches. Each branch ends in a rounded sporangium containing the spores. A priori, it has no roots and is attached to the ground by radicals, fine, superficially concentrated roots. Cooksonia plants release their spores into the air to reproduce. Cooksonia and the other primitive plants are confronted with the phenomenon of gravity, a physics that is new to them. They evolved by developing a hydraulic internal skeleton and a protective layer of wax. They are better able to support their own weight and cope with drought. The cuticle prevents the plant's water from evaporating, but it also forms a layer impermeable to carbon dioxide and oxygen. Over time, plants will develop tiny openings called stomata, enabling them to breathe through the air. Some have cells to distribute water and nutrients to higher organs, but at the time of the first plants, the soil was poor in nutrients. So plants develop rhizomes, like roots, to draw the food they need from the ground. Even though the soil was still almost non-existent, plants themselves helped to build it by breaking down the rocks on which they ventured. A little later, they develop outgrowths to increase the surface area exposed to solar energy. All these primitive plants must also find a way to reproduce. They cannot, like marine plants, discharge their gametes into the water. They must now find an aerial means of reproduction. This is done via spores. These are spread by the wind, and as they germinate, produce male or female organs, which in turn release their sex cells into the moist soil. The higher the plant, the more efficient the spore dispersal. This is why some plants try to grow taller, which also gives them the advantage of capturing even more of the sun's energy than their ground-level counterparts. Now, they need to give their stems more strength to support their weight and height. To this end, they add a woody support tissue. They can grow taller and taller and develop an ever-increasing diameter. Plants reach ever greater heights, with trunks measuring at least 10 centimeters or 4 inches in diameter. This may seem ridiculous compared with our present-day forests, but this primitive vegetation has nonetheless allowed other visitors to venture onto dry land. A few critters docked and ventured out onto the newly forming vegetation. But who are these curious little creatures? Probably earthworms, as life teems in the mud, or even mites. But the first real fossilized traces discovered are those of an extinct species of arthropod. The ebb and flow of the sea washes all kinds of organic waste and corpses onto the shore. This highly attractive food is a great incentive for carnivorous organisms to leave the waters. What's more, the desert is slowly becoming clothed in mosses, lichens, and other primitive plants, a tempting exploration ground for certain organisms. Curious, tiny, and discreet inhabitants shelter between grains of earth and roots beneath a layer of decomposing vegetation on which they feed. Primitive insects swarm in the midst of this growing vegetation. At first, the largest are no bigger than a few millimeters. They look like springtails, the pan-crustaceous jumping arthropods that populate our land today. Some are carnivores, feeding on the corpses of other animals, and others feed on plants, but none seem to attack them until they have rotted. Living plants certainly contain toxins they couldn't survive. It is these little beasts, so insignificant at first sight, that will eventually populate the whole Earth. Today, there are over 1.3 million known species of insect. They occupy almost every ecological niche. But this dominance didn't happen overnight. Although insects diversified very early on, in the Carboniferous period, they were initially present in small numbers. Campicaris obanensis belongs to the myriapod genus, closely related to millipedes. Its fossil was discovered in Scotland. Its legs have not been preserved. The animal measures approximately 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch in length. Its body is segmented. It evolved in an environment close to bodies of water, and certainly fed on decomposing plants. Although not their ancestor, they bear a striking resemblance to today's millipedes. Its body is covered by a carapace that is synthesized by its glands. Cooksonia fossils have been found in the same region. Strudiella devonica is a species of fossil arthropod. It is one of the oldest terrestrial insects found and the only complete fossil insect. This small insect, measuring around 8 millimeters in length, appears to be a close relative of the early grasshoppers. It has a relatively large head, with robust mandibles and long antennae. This specimen is wingless, which prevents scientists from knowing whether it is a larva or an adult. Strudiella devonica has all the morphological features and organs required for terrestrial life. Its unspecialized mouth parts indicate that it had an omnivorous diet. The fossil shows 6 body segments, 6 legs, and 2 antennae. The genitalia have not been preserved. The first arthropods to set foot on Earth were faced with a number of difficulties. They needed a structure strong enough to support them, as well as arrangements to protect them from ultraviolet light and desiccation. They also needed to find food. Surprisingly, most arthropods are carnivores, and few are herbivores. And to satisfy carnivores, prey must be available. Dry land is still relatively devoid of life, and the first arthropods may have had to make do with fungi, molds, or rotting leaves. The first plants were therefore not a source of food, but they helped to shape the first ecosystems that gradually spread across the land. At the same time, as life was gaining ground on land, it was demonstrating real innovation in marine organisms. The Devonian is reputed to be the period known as the Age of Fish. Numerous gigantic armored fish, known as placoderms, crisscrossed the oceans, including Bothriolepis, Silurians, and Dunkleosteus. While life on land is represented only by small organisms, life in the oceans is luxuriant. Its evolution was not unrelated to the emergence from the sea. Placoderms are the vertebrates that dominate the marine world. They are highly diversified, frequenting both reefs and the open sea. They feed on algae, mollusks, and other fish. They owe their name placoderm to the plates that cover their skin. Their head and thorax are covered by a thick bony armor that protects vital organs such as the eyes, brain, and heart from predators. Their enormous jaws, made of bone with sharp edges, are like pincers that can cut their prey in two. Although placoderms were the first to be equipped with jaws, they still lack teeth. Around 400 million years ago, the group of jawed fish diversified into 2 major groups. On the one hand, cartilaginous fish, from which sharks, rays, and other chimeras evolved, and on the other, bony fish. Subsequently, bony fish are divided into 2 groups. Bony fish, known as actinopterygians, have fins with keratin rays, the protein that makes up hair, nails, and horns. The rays are shaped like arms that support the fin fan. Alongside them, bony fish with fleshy or lobed fins are called sarcopterygians. Their fins are characterized by bones that form an articulated internal skeleton. The ventral fin bones are identical in number and position to those of the tetrapod extremities. This new form of fin is now articulated around a single element, the other rays having disappeared. It's not yet a leg, but it sure looks like one. The fin ends in a soft veil of scales. Panderichthys is an extinct genus of sarcopterygians that is considered an anatomically transitional form in the evolution from fish to tetrapod. The internal skeleton of the pectoral and pelvic fins is reminiscent of Chiridian limbs. The best-known species is Panderichthys rhombolepis, which resembles a modern-day catfish. It measures between 90 and 130 centimeters or 50 inches. It has primitive lungs. This species marks an important stage in the adaptation to terrestrial locomotion, since its fleshy pectoral fins are prototypes of tetrapod limbs. This suggests that the transition to tetrapod locomotion, which relies on hind limb propulsion, went through a stage of forelimb support accompanied by body undulation. In fact, the pelvic fins of Panderichthys rhombolepis are primitive and do not allow it to take support. A few million years later, the veil at the end of the fin would evolve into a revolutionary structure in living organisms: fingers. Meanwhile, vegetation continued to grow. Primitive plants have grown so much that they can now be called trees. It took a good 50 million years for the first giant ferns, calamites, and lepidodendrons to reach heights of over 30 meters or 100 feet. At this size, the trunk is reinforced with wood and bark, like that of today's trees. The arborescent form appeared independently in different plant groups. Archaeopteris is like a fern with a coniferous trunk. It thrives in well-drained areas where it can develop its extensive root system. It contributes to the formation of deep soils. It can reach heights of up to 40 meters or 130 feet, and measure up to 1.5 meters or 5 feet in diameter. Its wood is similar to that of conifers, with tracheids and rays. Many scientists have studied the anatomy of its trunk, making it the first modern tree. The wood of Archaeopteris becomes both a conductive tissue and a support element, an ideal combination for seeking light at height. Watieza is a close relative of modern ferns and horsetails. It is one of the components of the oldest forests and is considered the oldest arborescent plant. Its general appearance is reminiscent of modern palm trees or tree ferns. It can reach heights of up to 8 meters. Instead of leaves, Watieza has fronds located in the crown in a vertical position and positioned helically on the trunk. In some plants, fronds play the role of leaves. They are often large and divided into segments. As it grows, Watieza loses its fronds, leaving scars on the surface tissue of the stem. The trunk is rather thin, with grooves in the area around the crown, the scars of the lost fronds. This tall plant remains upright thanks to its inverted conical morphology and the large number of small roots that penetrate perpendicularly into the soil. One representative of the first forests is the Gilboa petrified forest in the United States. This forest was discovered during the excavation of a quarry to build the Gilboa Dam. Hundreds of large fossilized stumps preserved in the rock were identified. It would take several years of study and research to understand this forest a little better. The bases of the trees making up the forest are bowl-shaped, and their diameter can reach up to 2 meters or 7 feet. Thousands of roots surround them. According to estimates, the tree could reach up to 10 meters or 33 feet in height and resemble palm trees or tree ferns. Horizontal woody stems, measuring around 15 centimeters or 6 inches in diameter, were also discovered. These are creeping trunks of a neurophytalian progymnosperm, previously known only for their upright branches. A large specimen of lycopod was also discovered. This herbaceous plant has axes covered with small, narrow, microphyllous leaves. Fertile leaves have 5 segments, like vegetative leaves, and sporangia are inserted on the upper surface of each. This primitive forest already displays extraordinary complexity. The Tiktaalik roseae is the only known species of Tiktaalik, which literally means great fish of the low waters. The Tiktaalik has all the characteristics of a fish. It has scales and gills, but its triangular, flattened head and unusually shaped fins stand out. In fact, in addition to the fine ray-shaped bones that all fish have for paddling, the fins have much stronger internal bones, enabling the animal to wedge itself in shallow water using its limbs for support. This is what most four-legged animals do. This particular fin makes Tiktaalik a transitional species between fishes and Pandarictus, and the future first tetrapods, Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. The fins of Tiktaalik roseae have wrist bones and simple finger-like rays. It has gills but also primitive lungs. This enables it to establish itself in shallow waters and on land. Its scales are diamond-shaped, its teeth are structured in 2 rows, and it has internal and external nostrils. Most fish have bony plates in the gill area, limiting head movement. Tiktaalik roseae has none. This makes it the first known fish to have a neck and pectoral girdle separate from the skull. This gives it greater freedom to hunt prey, whether in the water or on land. The rays of Tiktaalik roseae's pectoral fins, those that evolved to form the front legs of tetrapods, have become more robust, and an asymmetry has developed between the rays on the ventral and dorsal sides. The latter become wider and more numerous than the former. This characteristic has resulted in a fleshy, palm-like part that the animal can use to hold itself up on the ground or in rivers. This suggests the presence of muscles under the fins to support the animal's weight when pulling itself up in the open air. Another visible evolution on the animal is that its eyes and nostrils are positioned above the head. As brackish waters are low in oxygen, it is forced to breathe at the surface. This feature enables it to breathe without taking its head out of the water, like today's crocodiles. Tiktaalik rosea is somewhere between a fish and a tetrapod. Its anatomical characteristics make it an intermediate species. Acanthostega and Ichthyostega were among the first tetrapods, defined as legged fish. They were aquatic animals with gills, but their 8-toed legs enabled them to navigate muddy, cluttered environments out of the water. Acanthostega is considered one of the first terrestrial vertebrates. It has chiridial limbs, articulated locomotor appendages equipped with fingers, an anatomical feature of the first tetrapods. Acanthostega measures around 60 centimeters in length. On each of its hands it has 8 fingers linked by a tendinous sheath. It has no wrists but a shoulder and a forelimb similar to those of a fish. However, the shoulder and forelimb cannot be bent forward or at the elbow, and cannot be used for standing or walking. He therefore had to use them for paddling or clinging to vegetation. Its pelvic girdle becomes a load-bearing structure, enabling it to counteract the force of gravity when it is no longer in the water. Although Acanthostega has lungs, its ribs are too short to support the rib cage outside an aquatic environment. Many scientists agree that Acanthostega would never have lived outside the sea and would have been primarily an aquatic animal. It must have come ashore to find food. Its jaw shows a difference from that of fish, which would have enabled it to feed on food either out of the water or on land. Alongside Acanthostega, Ichthyostega is one of the oldest known four-limbed vertebrates. Ichthyostega is a rather large animal for its time, measuring around 1.5 meters or 5 feet in length. Its eyes are set on top of a flattened skull, and it has large teeth. Its limbs are long, with 7 toes on each end of the hind limbs. The morphology of its shoulder and pelvic girdles is more robust and better adapted to terrestrial life than that of Acanthostega. Its vertebrae are also stronger. How did the fingers get added to the limb tips of these early tetrapods? Were the fingers pre-existing elements, or did they transform and evolve over time? The latest research suggests that the fingers originated from abnormal growth of the fin tips. In the fish embryo, the fin tips form the apical ridge through which the bony rays of the fin are formed. Once all the rays have formed, the ridge peels off, stopping the construction of new bony structures on the fin. The fin then forms a veil and completes its development. The anomaly that led to the development of the fingers would have been that the apical ridge failed to detach. After forming the bones of the arm, forearm, and wrist, it then went on to build the phalanges. With their fingers, Acanthostega and Ichthyostega were able to survey muddy deltas dotted with plants and tree branches. They were able to spread branches and wade through mud, as well as move from one arm of a river to the other. Their life remained essentially aquatic. Their legs are still not very functional, as the absence of joints makes them very rigid. As they have no ankles, they are unable to extend themselves. These protopatties are therefore only good for carrying fish and being used as paddles for travel. Finally, at the end of the Devonian period, 360 million years ago, these legs came in very handy. Terrestrial environments became increasingly vast as ocean levels dropped. Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, along with their tetrapod congeners, are able to reach isolated bodies of water and rivers. They survived this new environment better than others. It was during the Carboniferous period that flexible ankles, wrists, and elbows gave them incredible mobility. They could now leave the water's edge and venture out to conquer the immense forests that had in the meantime colonized dry land. Soon after Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, sea scorpions and spiders reached dry land. But this conquest was halted by another massive glaciation, which led to a mass extinction. 75% of the species that existed in the Devonian disappeared. The Earth emerges from a major mass extinction, resulting in the death of many animals. At this time, the continents Laurasia and Gondwana come together to form a supercontinent called Pangea. It is surrounded by the Panthalassa Ocean. Tectonic plate movements cause sea levels to rise. Many of the plants that remain on dry land are drowned. But nature has not said its last word. Forests continue to colonize. In the midst of tree ferns and giant horsetails, a new tree has appeared, the Lepidodendron. It's one of the giant lycopods, oversized plants that have dominated the Earth for a long time. The Lepidodendron reaches heights of over 50 meters or 165 feet, with a trunk 2 meters or 7 feet in diameter. Its trunk is firmly anchored to the ground by numerous roots. It has no intermediate branches, but is topped by a crown of foliage arranged like a parasol. This is when bark and seed trees appear. Bark trees became the source of coal, which was used in abundance during the Industrial Revolution. Following fires or floods, these trees were buried and formed sediments. Deprived of air and subjected to high pressure, organic elements are transformed into carbon compounds. The emergence of seed plants was a botanical revolution and a new step in the development of life on land. Henceforth, plant reproduction was no longer dependent on water and became aerial. The elements that ensure the plant's dissemination are no longer spores, but seeds. These multicellular seeds are protected by protective envelopes formed by the lignified integuments of the ovule. They contain not only an embryo, but also the reserves such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins needed for its development during the early stages. The seed detaches from the plant and ensures the dissemination of the species. Their tiny size and hooks enable them to attach themselves to animals, while their appendages provide a grip on the wind, all characteristics that facilitate dispersal. Seeds also have another fundamental characteristic. Their tissues are dehydrated, allowing them to enter dormancy when conditions are unfavorable for germination. Seeds can therefore be buried in the soil for several years before germinating. Animals continue to develop and adapt to dry land. In the mid-Carboniferous, sea levels drop again. The extension of terrestrial environments isolates bodies of water. But tetrapods now have limbs that can bend, and they adapt very well to this new environment. They also have lungs and are ready to conquer the gigantic Carboniferous forests that offer them a moist, shady environment in which to live. Amphibians were the first tetrapods. They were able to live both in water and on land. They had lungs to breathe air, but they also had to lay their eggs in water. But a new phylum appeared during the Carboniferous period, the reptiles. These were the first tetrapods to be fully adapted to life on land. They had a body covered in scales that protected them from predators and the elements. They also laid their eggs on land. Insects developed rapidly during this period. Insects have diversified very rapidly since they first appeared. By the Carboniferous, they accounted for at least 60% of biodiversity. In just a few million years, this group outnumbered their main terrestrial competitors. Their secret? A very useful feature for survival in this world of predators: wings. The group of wingless insects known as apterygotes represents just 1% of today's insects. Their congeners have largely overtaken them. The appearance of wings is difficult to date and explain. Perhaps they were gills, modified to enable aquatic organisms to fly short distances? This is just one hypothesis among many. What is certain is that thanks to their gravity-defying wings, insects were the sole masters of the air for several million years. Although flora, with the appearance of seed plants, gradually freed themselves from the aquatic environment, animals remain dependent on water for their food, and above all for their reproduction. A major innovation occurred around 310 million years ago with the appearance of the amnion. This is the envelope that allows the amniote embryo to develop in a liquid environment. Its innovative feature is that it can be laid out of the water. The embryo is thus protected from drying out and shocks. At the same time, some animals are equipped with a dry, more or less watertight skin to slow down water loss through the skin. Several groups of vertebrates, such as reptiles, birds, and mammals, were equipped with an amniotic sac. These groups of animals can now move away from the aquatic environment, as can amphibians, which remain water-dependent. The amniotic egg combined with the waterproof skin of the first reptiles enabled them to venture into continental areas previously inaccessible to them. They diversified, giving rise to numerous groups such as crocodilians, turtles, lizards, snakes, birds, and mammals. The appearance of the first flowering plants in the history of life on Earth is very difficult to date, as they are difficult to fossilize. Nonetheless, they play an essential role for the plants that bear them, attracting insects for pollen dissemination. Exceptional paleontological deposits have led to the discovery of two extremely well-preserved flowers. The first, Archifructus, resembles today's water lilies, but its anatomical organization remains unclear. The second, Montsechia, has long, narrow stems. Numerous fruits are found throughout the plant. These primitive flowering plants have little in common with the more classic flowers we know today. Since they first appeared, flowering plants have continued to diversify. Today, there are over 270,000 species in all environments, whether on land or in water. They range in size and shape from orchids to oak trees. By comparison, the fern group comprises 10,000 species, and the pine and associated species group around 750. And yet, these two groups are much older than flowering plants. The latter are therefore a true evolutionary success story. This is perhaps due to the way flowering plants reproduce, enabling them to rapidly colonize all types of environment. Fauna and flora are now well established on land. Although they will suffer disasters over the years, leading to more or less profound modifications, nothing will totally wipe them out. What are the effects of this outflow of water on the Earth? The colonization and establishment of life on the continents caused major changes to planet Earth over hundreds of millions of years. Land plants were the first to colonize the Earth outside water. Their roots contribute to soil formation. They break up rocks, facilitating the concentration of organic matter. Soils are essential for plant growth and have important geological implications, particularly with regard to erosion and land stability. Plant roots help prevent soil erosion by stabilizing the soil. Forests and meadows help to slow the flow of water. Particles transported by watercourses can thus be sedimented. This contributes to the formation of sedimentary rock. Certain living organisms, such as lichens and bacteria, promote the chemical alteration of rocks by releasing organic acids that can dissolve minerals. As a result, rocks disintegrate and soils are formed. Living organisms are mainly made up of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. When they die, organic matter is decomposed by microbial activity. If this happens in an aerobic environment, all the carbon is converted into carbon dioxide, and mineralization is complete. If, on the other hand, this takes place in an anaerobic environment, mineralization stops as soon as all the oxygen initially present has been consumed. Most of the biomass undergoes total mineralization. The remaining 1%, which sediments, is the source of oil, natural gas, and coal. In this way, the accumulation of plant debris in rapidly sedimenting areas during the Carboniferous period created large reserves of carbon that are used today in the form of coal. The weathering of limestone can then be accelerated, leading to the formation of caves. Caves are underground voids of varying sizes. Microbial activity in the soil contributes to the production of carbon dioxide. The appearance of life and its emergence from the waters involve complex interactions between chemical elements, geological processes, and living organisms. This has had a major impact on the establishment and evolution of biogeochemical cycles. These cycles are essential to the regulation of ecosystems and the survival of life on Earth. Biogeochemical cycles are the processes by which elements or chemical compounds are transported or transformed between the major terrestrial reservoirs, the geosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere, in which the biosphere is found. Through a series of processes, elements move from one medium to another, returning to their original environment in an infinite recycling loop. Living organisms need a constant and regular supply of essential elements such as carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur to ensure their survival. Elements circulate continuously from one environment to another, from one form to another. They are found in soil, atmosphere, water, and living tissue. This continuous circulation is known as the biogeochemical cycle. These cycles combine biological, chemical, and geological processes. Biological processes are defined as respiration or digestion. Chemical processes are combustion or synthesis reactions. The latter two take place over relatively short periods of time. Geological processes, on the other hand, occur over much longer timescales and are defined by erosion or sedimentation. The establishment of biogeochemical cycles on Earth is a complex process that has developed over billions of years. These cycles have evolved in response to interactions between chemical elements, geological processes, living organisms, and terrestrial, aquatic, and atmospheric environments. The colonization of land by plants and animals has had a major impact on biogeochemical cycles. Many mechanisms are involved, but let's take a look at the four most important cycles. The carbon cycle. The significant greening of continents apart from the polar and desert regions is a major change in Earth's history. This conquest of land by plants is not without consequences, as terrestrial plants are important players in the carbon cycle. Plants use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to form their own living matter through the process of photosynthesis. In addition, their root cells breathe and release some CO2 into the soil. This creates acidic solutions in their vicinity and encourages the weathering of rocks, which in the long term traps carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The development of terrestrial vegetation also deepens soils by a few centimeters to 1 meter on average. The increase in continental vegetation has reduced the greenhouse effect and cooled the climate. In the long term, dead organic matter accumulates on the soil in the form of plant biomass, helping to form soils rich in organic carbon. This is then buried and transformed into fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, or natural gas. This transformation requires soil carbon sequestration. The nitrogen cycle. The massive arrival of plants on land has also had an impact on the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere. Today's air contains 78% of it. This element is essential to the functioning of living organisms, since it is used to make proteins and produce the nitrogenous bases present in DNA. However, it cannot be directly assimilated in its initial form by most living organisms. We must therefore rely on bacteria to transform atmospheric nitrogen into a form that can be assimilated by other organisms. Through its biogeochemical cycle, nitrogen passes from one form to another. Bacteria, such as cyanobacteria and rhizobium, which live in symbiosis with plants, capture atmospheric nitrogen and transform it into ammonia, which is then used directly by plants and animals and reacts with hydrogen to form ammonium. Oxidation reactions then come into play, with some bacteria oxidizing ammonium to form nitrite, while others oxidize nitrite to form nitrate. Transported in soil or water, nitrate and ammonium are captured by plants through their roots. Nitrogen now fixed on plants is available to herbivorous animals and is passed on in the terrestrial food chain. Carnivorous animals ingest nitrogen by feeding on herbivorous animals. Nitrogen is then present in plant and animal waste. Certain fungi and bacteria decompose it and produce ammonia, which dissolves to form ammonium. Certain bacteria, known as denitrifying bacteria, convert nitrate into dinitrogen, returning it directly to the atmosphere. The phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle was greatly disrupted when living organisms colonized dry land. Phosphorus is essential to life. It is a basic material in DNA, bones, shells, and teeth. The phosphorus cycle is sedimentary, meaning that it does not involve atmospheric processes, as it has virtually no gaseous components. The main source of phosphorus is the erosion of sedimentary rocks. Under the action of rain and wind, small quantities of phosphorus escape from the rocks. It is released in the form of dissolved phosphate and enters the food chain, starting with plants. The latter directly assimilate this essential element for their growth. Herbivores then feed on the plants, which are then eaten by carnivores. Phosphates are returned to the soil via animal feces and urine, as well as through the degradation of animals and plants once they have died. However, over time, some phosphorus has been leached from the soil and transported to the oceans, where it has become trapped in marine sediments. Human activities have resulted in additional phosphorus inputs. The mining of these phosphates for fertilizer production has altered the phosphorus cycle, leading to environmental disturbances such as eutrophication of watercourses. Water quality declines, affecting the ecosystem and the aquatic environment. The water cycle. The proliferation of terrestrial vegetation has influenced the water cycle by promoting evapotranspiration. This is the process by which terrestrial liquid water is returned to the atmosphere in gaseous form. This water comes from the sublimation of snow, the evaporation of free water, or water buried in the ground, and also from plant transpiration. How do plants, and trees in particular, transpire? You've probably noticed how nice and cool it is in the heart of a forest when it's hot. A tree actively cools the surrounding air, like a parasol, which simply reflects the sun's rays. A tree combines both actions. To grow, plants need nutrients and CO2, which they absorb and store through photosynthesis. Sap circulates through the tree, transferring mineral salts to the leaves for photosynthesis. Transpiration is the driving force, transporting water and nutrients to the leaves. sap flows are regulated according to plant needs and climatic conditions. Transpiration takes place in the leaves, at the stomata, and in the lenticels on the bark of trunks and branches. Depending on environmental conditions, stomata may close to avoid excessive water loss. Nevertheless, the quantity of water released by a tree during evapotranspiration is very significant. For an oak tree, this amounts to 1,000 liters of water per day. Evapotranspiration is an essential component of the water cycle. Although it represents only a small part of the overall water cycle, it is fundamental. It transfers water from the soil and vegetation to the atmosphere. At present, urbanization, deforestation, and other practices that make soil impermeable reduce evapotranspiration and alter the water cycle by altering the infiltration of water into the soil. The consequences are flooding, reduced groundwater reserves, and changes in precipitation patterns. Life could not emerge from the water until it had a shield to protect it from the sun's ultraviolet rays. This is the ozone layer. Oxygen is present in 3 forms in the atmosphere. There are oxygen atoms, O, oxygen molecules, O2, which represent the oxygen we breathe, and ozone, O3. Ozone is a molecule made up of 3 oxygen atoms. It is a colorless gas, but has a very strong odor. Ozone is formed in a section of the atmosphere known as the stratosphere. In this region, high-energy solar photons can strike oxygen molecules and separate the 2 oxygen atoms. When a free oxygen atom comes into contact with an oxygen molecule O2, an ozone molecule is formed. Ozone is then naturally degraded in the stratosphere through a series of chemical transformations under the effect of the sun's ultraviolet rays. In an unpolluted atmosphere, ozone production and destruction exactly balance each other out. Its total concentration then remains relatively constant. Ozone naturally accumulates in the stratosphere, but is only present in abundance when there is sufficient oxygen. Scientific research estimates that the first threshold of the ozone layer was formed around 600 million years ago. This first threshold allowed an explosion of life during the Ediacaran period and later during the Cambrian. It was then present at 90% of today's ozone levels. The second threshold was reached around 400 million years ago, coinciding with the emergence of the first animals from the waters. The molecules making up living matter are photosensitive, which means they can be destroyed by certain types of radiation, such as ultraviolet light. Ozone absorbs a large proportion of ultraviolet rays, protecting living organisms from their harmful effects. When the Earth was first formed, it was covered in volcanoes, and the atmosphere consisted mainly of carbon dioxide and methane. There was no oxygen or ozone. In those days, without an ozone layer, the sun's ultraviolet rays reduced all organisms to aquatic and simple single-cell life. Around 600 million years ago, the accumulation of oxygen by cyanobacteria and other oxygen-releasing organisms enabled the atmosphere to reach a first threshold of oxygen, and thus ozone. When the first terrestrial arthropods emerged from the waters around 400 million years ago, the second threshold, equivalent to the present one, was reached. The oxygen produced by living organisms such as plants and the first forests slowly reached the upper layers of the atmosphere, where it was degraded by ultraviolet radiation, giving rise to ozone. Ozone supports the development of life when it is present in the stratosphere, above 15 kilometers or 9 miles in altitude. Ozone concentrations peak at around 25 kilometers or 15 miles above sea level. It is precisely this ozone-rich region of the atmosphere that is known as the ozone layer. Moreover, the amount of ozone present at any given point on the Earth's surface varies according to day, season, and latitude. The emergence of life forms from the water represents a quantum leap in the evolution of life on Earth. If this has been possible, it's because life on land has many advantages over life in the water, although this largely depends on the needs and preferences of the organisms in question. Terrestrial organisms have direct access to atmospheric air, which is far more abundant in oxygen than that dissolved in the aquatic environment. This facilitates air breathing. What's more, air is less dense than water. Land-dwelling organisms don't have to fight against buoyancy, allowing for a greater diversity of body shapes and structures. On land, solar energy is harnessed to a greater extent, and body temperature is more easily regulated. Its direct use for photosynthesis is an advantage over aquatic organisms, which receive limited energy from the depths. Remember, during the Devonian period, life is indeed booming in the ocean. All this little world proliferates in the warm, luminous waters without thinking for a second that things are about to change radically. At the end of the Devonian, however, a great extinction struck the planet once again. The first had taken place in the Ordovician. Geological and climatic changes and other upheavals due to major terrestrial activity wiped out thousands of marine species. Contrary to popular belief, this extinction was progressive rather than brutal and radical. It took place over tens of thousands of years, but the consequences are there for all to see. 75% of marine animals have disappeared. At that time, the Earth was occupied by a single continent, located at the South Pole, while a string of islands and archipelagos stretched out at the equator. All the rest was just an immense ocean. On land, life was almost non-existent, apart from near the coast and in wetlands. A few insects and a few tetrapodomorphs tried their hand at life on land, but nothing had yet been gained for these first settlers. It has to be said that the environment at the end of the Devonian was still rather hostile, and conditions were not really ripe for the arrival of living creatures. At the gateway to the Carboniferous, the situation is still much the same. Life on land is still a long way off. Under the ocean, on the other hand, life is beginning to reassert itself and adapt to the various changes. As has been the case since our first voyages in the Cambrian, life is rich and abundant once again. Sponges, corals, brachiopods, nautiloids, and of course fish of all kinds enjoy this new underwater haven. Let's take a look at a typical Carboniferous seascape. What plant and animal species inhabit this underwater setting? First of all, as you now know, the epicontinental sea that formed in the Carboniferous favored the creation of a new biotope. The waters here are shallow, 200 meters or 700 feet at most. But this region of the ocean benefits from the sun's luminosity and warmth. Corals quickly establish themselves here. Everything is in place to encourage their growth. Whether solitary or colonial, they build extensive reefs in the warm waters of the Paleothus. These in turn encourage the expansion of other species. Brachiopods such as this Productus greatly appreciate this marine region. It lives and feeds on the seabed. The small spines that can be seen in the dorsal valve are not a defensive weapon against predators. For that, the shell is the only protection it has. The spines, on the other hand, are useful for holding on tightly to the bottom. In brachiopods, these spines can be more or less prominent, depending on whether the substrate is muddy or hard. The genus Productus was quite diverse in the Carboniferous. Here we see a Productus giganteus, here a Productus subaculeatus, and over there a Productus cora or a Productus punctatus. The giganteus is undoubtedly the most exceptional of these. Scientists believe it to be the largest brachiopoda ever to have lived on our planet. It could reach 30 to 35 centimeters, or 13 inches. Like the other members of its group, it naturally occupies the seabed, preferring shallow, muddy waters. Aside from this preferred location, this brachiopod adapts to all regions. It can be found in Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Buried in sand or mud, its imposing size, weight, and sturdy spines give it great stability in the water. Waves do not prevent it from remaining firmly attached to its substrate. Unable to move, this sessile animal has a diet adapted to its own physical limitations. It feeds by filtration to extract suspended phytoplankton. For this reason, it settles in shallow waters that take full advantage of the sun's rays. Its favorite food, phytoplankton, thrives here. To extract these planktonic particles, it uses an organ called a lophophore. The lophophore surrounds the mouth. It's a highly efficient system, a real collector of suspended particles. The lophophore is made up of tentacles and can take on a variety of shapes: ring-shaped, horseshoe-shaped, or coiled. It's hollow and silated, so it can catch particles. One problem with being fixed is reproduction. In Giganteus, scientists believe that gametes are released into the water column. Other suspension-feeding sessile animals are the blastoids, notably the yellow blastoid, such as Orphiocrinus, and the crinoids, such as the red crinoid. Let's start with the blastoids. These are part of the so-called echinoderms. The echinoderm is characterized by a body protected by a set of interlocking, firmly welded limestone plates. These plates form what is known as a theca, a hard, mineralized, very solid envelope. In these animals, the mouth is in the center, but all around it, like petals around a flower pistil, are mouth depressions. These have two important roles to play. Firstly, they support the filtering organs called brachioles. Secondly, they also contain the animal's respiratory pores. This is not the only echinoderm present here. Another member of this group evolves very close to our blastoid. Do you notice it? It has a very distinct shape and blends in so well with the scenery that you could walk right past it without thinking for a second that it's an animal. In fact, it looks more like a plant, but if you get a little closer, you'll see that it's actually a marine animal with an articulated limestone skeleton. It also has a kind of root to anchor itself to the ground, and a calyx with long, flexible arms to filter the plankton it feeds on from the water. Or should we say, feed on in the plural, since they rarely live in isolation from one another. Have these precious clues put you on the right track? This famous echinoderm, the king of camouflage, is a crinoid, and more precisely, right in front of us is a red crinoid. The filtration system of crinoids is quite different from that of blastoids. They filter seawater by fanning out their arms. They then transport the plankton to their mouths by means of tiny cilia covering the arms. These cilia are called pinnules. Depending on the species, the arms can measure up to 50 centimeters or 20 inches long. Here we can estimate a length of 30 centimeters or 12 inches. Unlike other parts of its body, the crinoid's pinnules are soft. They are the only part of the body without a calcified skeleton, to ensure flexibility of movement and therefore perfect optimization of filtration. And as if that weren't enough, to be sure of winning every time, these pinnules secrete a sticky glue. A formidable plankton magnet, this ability enables it to find food in abundance in this sunny part of the ocean. But in the sea, there are still a multitude of animals of all shapes and sizes to be discovered. Take this mollusk, for example. It's a cephalopod, to be precise. You may remember that this genus, the gonionites, diversified greatly during the Devonian. This continued into the Carboniferous. In fact, this is the period when they developed and diversified the most. Gonionites are marine animals with shells. Their shells are highly distinctive. Unlike others, they have several chambers within the shell, separated by zigzag-shaped sutures. If you look closely, you can see that one of these chambers is larger than the others. This is where the cephalopod lives. But the other chambers, while not used as living quarters, do have their uses. Each of them, filled with gas, plays a hydrostatic role. Thanks to this physical property, gonionites can swim in open water and maintain a pressure balance as required. They are said to be nectonic. Unlike plankton, nekton can swim, even against the current. On the other hand, they are far from being able to compete with fish. They are not equipped for fast swimming, nor are they renowned for any particular skill. But that doesn't seem to bother him in the least. He's adapted to his condition and sets off in search of food. Sight is his guide. The cephalopod has two rather well-developed eyes. It also has tentacles, no doubt useful for feeding. This, at least, is the hypothesis put forward by paleobiologists. In fact, despite the few fossils in the possession of museums, scientists are faced with an unanswered question when it comes to the lifestyle and diet of gonionites. There are no sufficiently convincing clues that these animals had a benthic lifestyle, for example. There is very little evidence to support a reliable hypothesis about the diet of gonionites. The only thing we can be sure of is that they lacked the calcified, beaked jaws of some of their relatives. We can therefore rule out hard-shelled and shell-bearing animals from their diet. While many marine species take advantage of these shallow waters to diversify, some are in decline. The number of marine arthropods has fallen drastically. This is particularly true of trilobites. But some are luckier than others. Some arthropods, for the time being at least, endure despite the difficulties facing the genus. This is a megarachne, a eurypterid. Aquatic or semi-aquatic, we don't really know. It measures nearly 60 centimeters or 24 inches when its legs are extended. But we'll meet it a little later in the trip. Not far away, a little deeper, we should be able to spot other marine species. As we were saying, marine animals come in all shapes and sizes. As you can see, the corals are home to quite different species from what we've seen so far. This time, no shells, no calcified skeletons either, but fins. Look, here we are in front of a shoal of Uranothus. They seem to enjoy swimming in the midst of these days of yellow blastoids and red crinoids undulating in the current. Unfortunately for these fish, they'll have to postpone their nautical activities and think about protecting themselves quickly from the approaching predator. The mastodon you see now is a member of the Stephacanthus genus. If we have doubts about the diet of the gonionites, we know pretty well the diet of the predator that will follow, Acmonistion zangrelli. Stephacanthus is an extinct genus of primitive holocephalus. It is one of the first cartilaginous fish to have lived on our planet, along with Cladocelicae and Gladbachus. This makes it one of the oldest sharks on the planet. But this prestigious title doesn't seem to dampen his ardor. He's on the hunt. Stephacanthus is a predator that thrives in both fresh and salt water, where we also find ourselves. Measuring up to 2 meters or 7 feet for the largest, it is quite similar to our contemporary sharks. Its name means anvil shark. As you can imagine, this name is inspired by its distinctive morphology. You can clearly see the anvil-shaped fin on its back. However, this is not the case for females. Only the males display this prominence. Why did males have this distinctive dorsal fin? There are 2 possibilities. The first suggests that it was used to attract the attention of females. The second suggests that it was an advantage for males when they had to fight each other to establish their position and conquer a female. This primitive shark lived in shallow waters, mainly coastal areas. It feeds on crustaceans and mollusks, but also on fish. Contrary to popular belief, not all cartilaginous animals are sharks, nor are they all large fish. To understand this, let's go a little deeper into the ocean. The fish we're about to meet are particularly fond of the deep sea. Here we can observe a school of Falcatus, another holocephalus. It has very large eyes. Do you know why? It's very dark here. We're no longer in the photic part of the ocean. These big eyes are very useful for seeing clearly in such darkness. It also has a homocercal tail fin. The caudal fin is located at the rear end of the fish. There are 4 forms of caudal fin. The homocercal form means that it is symmetrical with 2 equal lobes. The caudal fin is remarkably well developed in Falcatus. In other words, he must have been an outstanding swimmer. The shrimps that move here and there will undoubtedly serve as his breakfast. He loves these little creatures. Before leaving, did you notice anything else peculiar about him? The thorn. You're probably wondering what that thorn on his back is for. Is it really just for shrimping? No, it's something else. Like our previous shark, Thalcatus also has a very distinctive sexual dimorphism. Only males have this dorsal fin, with a sort of spine projecting forward. Now it's time to head back up to the light. It's nice to be back in a more familiar landscape, illuminated by the sun's rays breaking through the surface. We see corals, algae, echinoderms, blastoids, and many other small marine animals. Suddenly, the ocean is much more welcoming and reassuring. A few mollusks, crustaceans, and a variety of small fish wander through this thriving ecosystem. But small prey galore also means predators on the prowl. One of them is approaching, and the weaker ones are already panicking. They're right to be scared. There are big marine predators in the Carboniferous. Here it comes. This one belongs to the genus Chondrichthyans, i.e. cartilaginous fishes, and to the group of elasmobranchs that include sharks, rays, and sawfish in the order Selachii. Unlike sharks, it does not belong to the Selachii order, but to the Tenacanthiform, which means dragon shark. Sharks and dragon sharks have much in common, including 5 to 7 pairs of gill slits opening individually outwards, rigid dorsal fins, and small, placoid scales on the skin. The major difference between the two lies in the dorsal fins. These are made up of spines. The spines on the fins of Dracopristis, the specimen in front of us, were very large, measuring just over 55 centimeters or 22 inches long, i.e. around 25% of the total body length. Lurking at the bottom of the water, Dracopristis had to watch its back and protect itself from danger. Semi-buried in the ground, it can easily be attacked by a more powerful and imposing predator, such as Glycmanius occidentalis. Thanks to its famous prominent spines, it can counter attacks. The surprise effect when the predator rubs against the thorn in its mouth can give Dracopristis a few seconds to react. Dentition and mouth opening also present some distinctions between Selachii and Tenacanthiform, or if you prefer to call them that, between sharks and dragon sharks. Let's take the dentition of Dracopristis as a control for our comparative study. Its teeth are adapted to seize and crush its prey. The dentition consists of a long blade-like tooth, surrounded by numerous short fork-like teeth. It has 12 rows of teeth. Its teeth are designed to catch food and swallow it whole. There's no room for chance. The victim has very little chance of escaping alive. Sharks also have several rows of teeth, but they have a different shape, and there aren't several small teeth around a large blade, as here. The opening of this lethal weapon is also larger in Tenacanthiform, i.e. in Dracopristis, than in sharks. On the other hand, it is less flexible. Many sharks inhabit the ocean. We've already seen several types, as well as closely related creatures. Sharks appeared much earlier, in the Ordovician period, but they never managed to make their mark against other predators. The Carboniferous period is known as the Golden Age of Sharks. It was their extinction at the end of the Devonian period that allowed them to become the kings of the ocean. The extinction, so to speak, cleaned up the big predators. A vacant spot in the ocean was quickly filled by the shark group. They were then able to dominate the marine waters and give birth to a whole variety of forms as they diversified. While all the species we've seen so far live underwater, others haven't managed to choose between land and sea. Amphibians, or at least some of them, seem to enjoy both environments without distinction. It's with them that we'll be making our transition from aquatic to terrestrial life. We'll be taking our first steps on land, but for some time to come, we'll be avoiding going deeper into the continent. It's too early to survive in these distant lands. The forest hasn't hatched yet. It's dormant. It's getting ready. In the meantime, let's continue our journey along the coast and through the swamps. How did amphibians come to divide themselves between two worlds? By the end of the Devonian period, we had witnessed a major radiation of fish. Several hypotheses have been put forward as to the causes of these changes and evolutions. For them, answering the call of the continent had become inevitable for a number of reasons. Scientists point to two main plausible causes: to protect themselves from new predators, notably sharks, and to get around in waterways where the water level is very low and the tangle of branches and roots greatly hinders movement. Don't forget that the forest is gradually but surely taking root. For the moment, it can only do so in wetlands. This is a good thing for life on the mainland, but it does make things difficult for some fish. To get out of this predicament, these swimmers are starting to develop legs. Of course, at first, they're more like pseudopterans, but the machine has been set in motion. Without this evolution, there would probably be no amphibians, reptiles, birds, or even mammals on Earth. The appearance of legs brought with it a veritable revolution in the animals that would soon populate our planet. Alongside legs, the ability to breathe out of water was also discussed. Without this ability, walking on land would have been utopian. Sarcopterygians, bony fish with a swim bladder, a lung in short, are going to divert this organ from its original purpose. Initially dedicated to maintaining equilibrium in the water, lungs can now also be used to breathe the oxygen contained in the air. Nevertheless, these animals of a different kind still need the aquatic environment to live. Exclusive terrestrial life has not yet been fully conquered. The question of reproduction and the fragility of the egg, for example, is one of the reasons why exclusive terrestrial life is impossible. That's where we left off in our investigations at this stage in the evolutionary process of fish and pre-amphibians at the end of the Devonian. Let's resume our study of this conquest of the land with the now much more developed amphibians of the Carboniferous. The amphibians of this period are known as stegocephali, meaning head with plates. We're going to have to find them. Their morphology is quite remarkable, but they also know how to blend into the background. Let's start with a rather terrestrial animal, which we're sure will be easier to flesh out. This is Balaenoptera woody. It feeds on insects. We should be able to find them in the vegetation cover near this stream. Well, here's one. It's barely 20 centimeters or 8 inches long, but you can clearly see its long body, legs, and head. It's precisely at the back of its head that it has a large tympanic opening. This means that its hearing is well developed, even in the open air. Unlike some specimens found at the end of the Devonian period, our Balaenopteron has very strong bones. He's quite capable of supporting his weight and his movements out of the water. He looks like a salamander. His head, rather round and flat, but also his posture, give him this apparent resemblance. It has around 40 teeth on its upper jaw and 20 on its lower, making it an accomplished carnivore. Insects are its favorite diet. It was one of the first temnospondyls. This group has long withstood the many changes on our planet, and even certain biological crises. It survived until the Cretaceous period, when it was present on Earth for almost 220 million years. They lived much longer than the dinosaurs, for example, which are often used as a benchmark for comparing longevity. Let's continue our exploration. We're approaching a swamp. Unlike the first, this one has no legs. It lost them as it evolved. This may seem totally implausible to you, but tetrapods have repeatedly lost and regained their limbs over the course of biological evolution. Life knows how to adapt when necessary. Tetrapods are no exception. But let's get back to the swamp and the animal we're concerned with. It's an Ophiderpeton. It looks more like a snake and is quite long, close to 70 centimeters or 28 inches when fully grown. Now that you've got his picture in your head, you shouldn't miss him. Yes, it's really him. Ophiderpeton brownreyi. It has no fewer than 230 vertebrae. His large forward-facing eyes guide his hunt. He hides in the hollow of a burrow and comes out when hunger strikes. Insects, worms, millipedes, anything of reasonable size will fit in its mouth. Other amphibians also live in the area, but you have to leave the marshy area and approach the lake to catch a glimpse of them. You'll see that this body of fresh water is also teeming with life. This is Microbrachus. He too looks like a salamander. However, it has a total of 40 vertebrae and short limbs. This skeleton is not conducive to swimming. It does, however, manage with a body undulation system. It's not fast, but the technique is effective. In addition to the salamander, Microbrachus also closely resembles the axolotl. Do you notice the little membranes on the sides of its head? These are the remains of its larval gills. He keeps them as an adult. A little further on, we can see Amphibamus grandiceps. This time, at first glance, it's clear that it belongs to the amphibian group. The body is stockier and the head more triangular. It measures around 20 centimeters or 8 inches. When you look at its skeleton, it's easy to see how it can move. Its legs and long clawed toes help it to move on the ground. In the water, it's the tail that stands out. It's shaped like an oar and becomes a precious asset for getting around in open water. So it has two possible means of locomotion. He juggles between one and the other according to his needs. I'd like you to ask yourself about these two possibilities. Why live both in the water and on land? They have legs and lungs, so why don't they conquer the ground out of wetlands, lakes, rivers, and swamps? Every animal ability in nature has an origin, a raison d'être. If these animals preserve their aquatic and terrestrial abilities, it's for a good reason. The survival of a species depends on more than the availability of food. Without food, there is no energy. Without energy, the body withers and dies. But the survival of a species also depends on its ability to reproduce. It must be able to reproduce under the right conditions and multiply births so that the younger generation replaces the older. But for these animals, nothing is simple at the moment. Without the aquatic environment, embryos cannot survive. Another major revolution is now underway to counter this problem facing nature: the amniotic egg. To understand this revolution, we need to take a closer look at the amniotic egg. Here's a Hylonomus laeli, quite similar to our present-day lizards, and one of the very first amniotes. The amnion is a protective envelope. Inside is the embryo, of course, but also the amniotic fluid. In other words, it's as if the liquid environment has invited itself into the egg. The embryo is protected in this precious liquid. It can develop without fear. The amnion protects the embryo liquid unit. External pressure and desiccation are no longer an obstacle to the birth of life on Earth. An egg can finally survive on dry land. Beings like Hylonomus laeli can now move away from wetlands and into the forest. Their bodies have also adapted to this new way of life. Look at the skin. It no longer looks as moist or even vicious as the previous amphibians we met. It's drier. It's also tighter, making it easier to fight dehydration. In other words, when Hylonomus approaches a watering hole, it's only to drink when it's thirsty, but not for breeding purposes. Hylonomus wasn't the only amniote to live in the Carboniferous. Petrolacosaurus is also widely present. It's an important encounter because, according to some scientists, it's one of the oldest diopsids known. It may even have given rise to crocodiles, dinosaurs, and since birds are descended from it, even birds. In fact, diapsids are a clade of amniote tetrapods from the sauropsid clade, which includes all present-day birds and reptiles. One of the great particularities of diapsids is that their skulls have two pairs of temporal fossae, i.e. two openings. The squamosal and postorbital bones separate them. These openings allow the jaws to lock in a closed position, giving them greater strength when bitten. It fed on small forest insects. This little lizard-like animal ran faster than other species, especially on the ground. And lucky for him, despite being only 40 centimeters or 16 inches long, it was the prey of giants, such as Megarachne, and its 35 centimeter or 14-inch diameter, Meganeura and its 70 centimeter or 28-inch wingspan, or in a completely different genre, giant amphibians such as Proterogerinus. Let's close our tour of the land of amniotes with a synapsid. This is Archaeopteryx, the oldest known synapsid, along with the Chinerpeton. According to some paleobiologists, it is probably the distant ancestor of mammals. Archaeopteryx had strong jaws that could open wider than those of early reptiles. While its sharp teeth were all the same shape, it also had a pair of canines that were more enlarged than the other teeth. He lives here, at the edge of this lepidodendron forest. Speaking of forests, I think it's time we learn more about this new plant cover, don't you? Judging by the landscape in which this Archaeopteryx is growing, it seems to have developed quite well. While we were roaming the ocean and taking our first steps on the coast, a lot was happening on the continent. At the dawn of the Carboniferous, the forest was in its infancy. Now it covers a large part of the continent. It is a new ecosystem in its own right, providing food and shelter for many species of animals of all shapes and sizes. Our Archaeopteryx, for example, has found everything it needs to survive here. Before we go a little deeper into the coal forest, let's take a look at it from the air. Look at how the vegetation cover grows a little more every millennium, and how beautiful it is now. A luxuriant, rich, and varied forest is born. It didn't all happen in a day, of course. Time played its most beautiful part, following the order of things to create perfect harmony. Initially, the vegetation took root near water sources and wetlands. At that point, plant reproduction still required very specific characteristics. Without a wetland, the conquest of plants would have been, at least at their current stage of evolution, totally impossible. We'll see why. Other plants before them, such as Cooksonia, had prepared the ground. They managed to get away with it, growing in a wide band along coastlines and waterways. Their tilling of the soil then encourages the birth of other plants, which in turn develop and spread a little further over these wetlands. It's as if a virtuous circle is taking shape before our very eyes. But terrestrial vegetation doesn't just happen. Each has its own place and its own characteristics. We can now speak of a forest for its richness and diversity. In the water, we can see plants such as calamites. At the water's edge, we can also see a sphenophyllum. A few meters from the shore, species such as chordates, seed ferns, and sigillaria complete the picture. Deeper down, arborescent species dominate the landscape. Despite the medium-sized ferns, Ceronius, and Lepidodendron can also be seen. Chordate and sigillaria are also visible further inland. This pattern may vary from region to region, but whatever the location, the forest observes a certain pre-established order in which each plant has its place. As mentioned above, the Earth's climate, and therefore biotope, is clearly demarcated by distance from the equator. The significant variation in temperature between the poles of the equator leads to a zonation of vegetation. Large coal-bearing forests of Lepidodendron, sigillaria, calamites, and chordates develop at the equator, while forests of trees, such as Glossopteris, thrive in temperate zones. It's time to go deeper into the forest to understand the different challenges of this plant cover, but also to understand how plants have managed to adapt in order to grow, develop, and diversify. Let's start by looking at how they reproduce. This analysis will give us a better understanding of how vegetation has been able to conquer larger territories. Why did most plant species end up in wetlands? There's a very good reason. Their mode of reproduction required it. Initially, species develop in patches. This is explained by a mode of reproduction based on cell cloning. This development is typical of organisms whose capacity to exploit the environment is limited, as they do not yet have any real roots other than for light capture. In other words, cloning was the only way for them to reproduce quickly and efficiently, given the conditions available to them. But this mode of reproduction also has its limits. If it's useful on poor, hard soil, it's less so for conquering a larger territory. Then spores made their grand entrance. From then on, reproduction became easier, but certain elements had to be present for it to work. A mild climate is not enough. Humidity is necessary for germination. Spores are released by the plant, then germinate to form male or female plantlets, known as gametophytes. It is these gametophytes that produce the sex cells. To make a new plant, the gametophytes must come together so that their sex cells can meet. And in the vast majority of cases, water serves as the conduit for this rapprochement. Lepidodendrons, Sigillaria, calamites, and Pecopterus use this reproductive model to extend their territory. So, to go where the water isn't, we need to take another look at our mode of reproduction and be inventive. A mode in which the germination cell is protected. A mode where sex cells can meet without the intervention of water. This is precisely when the seed appears. The seed results from the fertilization of a female sex cell by a male sex cell. A fruit then hatches, housing the seeds. These contain all the plant's genetics. The pteridospermales take advantage of this new way of developing the species. They are seed ferns. This is also the case with the Cordiatalis. They had both male and female branches. The ovules, aided by the wind, could then receive the pollen grains and form a fruit in which the seeds nestled. These seeds can even lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to begin the germination process. A major advantage for reproduction in unfavorable climatic conditions. This is how new plants were able to conquer the Earth's soil, and how vast forests came into being. Some of these forests are known as coal forests. Even so, most of them were made up of spore-bearing plants, as the humid environment lent itself to this. These included Lepidodendrons, Sigillaria, calamites, and even tree ferns. But there were also some seed-bearing plants, like the Cordiatalis we've just seen, the first conifers, if you will, and seed-bearing ferns called pteridospermales. Now let's see why we speak of coal forests. How is coal formed? The production process is highly specific. The Carboniferous was the geological period when production was most intense. It was one of the events that marked this period and earned it its name. Since then, no production has been equaled in terms of intensity. For this coal to form, 3 elements are required. A dense forest, of course, but not just anywhere. It has to be close to the mountains and its feet in the water, in the heart of a marshy area. It's when all these elements come together, and only when they come together, that a particular phenomenon is triggered. When a lush, dense forest forms in a wetland between mountains, there comes a time when the ground sinks. The forest is drowned, so to speak. It gradually dies. Plant debris begins to accumulate slowly, but it doesn't decompose. Putrefaction is only possible if the fungi that cause it are present. According to scientists, this is not yet the case at this stage of life on Earth. You're probably wondering why I insisted on the presence of mountains. I'm getting to that. Sediment from the erosion of nearby mountains covers this plant debris. Depending on the region and the very makeup of the mountain range, the type of sediment may be different. In the case of clay, shale is formed. If it's sand, then sandstone will form later. The subsided and flooded area is then filled with these materials. A new cycle can begin. A new forest is formed. When it reaches its peak, the ground subsides. The forest is drowned and dies. Sediments cover the flooded area and the plant debris. They fossilize and charcoal forms. Then a new forest springs up, and so on. Each destroyed forest becomes a new coal seam. In some coal mining areas, there are hundreds of layers of fossilized forest. But this doesn't mean that the cycle is a quick one, taking just a handful of years. Coal is transformed very slowly. It takes millions of years to produce coal, and it takes on different forms, or rather, a different constitution, as it transforms before it can be called hard coal. We generally speak of coals and coal-bearing forests when referring to coal production. But this is misleading. Coal is a generic term, and hard coal is just one specific quality of coal. To better understand, let's look at the production of this phenomenon. The decomposition of plants in a low-oxygen, fungus-free environment during the Carboniferous period first takes the form of peat. Peat is the incomplete decomposition of plants in a water-saturated zone. In other words, it is a fossil organic material. It contains relatively little carbon, around 60%. After a few million years, peat becomes lignite. This is the first stage of fossil plant coal. It is brown and compact. It's the first stage of coal, but also the least qualitative, at least in terms of combustible energy. As coal transforms, its carbon content increases. Next comes hard coal, a fossilized vegetable coal with an even higher carbon content than lignite. It is also black in color, but brighter. After hard coal comes anthracite. This time the carbon content approaches 94%. It is so concentrated that it is difficult to ignite. The final stage is graphite. This is pure crystallized carbon. It is no longer flammable. So man is looking for the best quality coal with a sufficiently high carbon content, but still easily flammable, to make a perfect fuel. Hard coal is the preferred fuel, and it's this interest in man that has made him the talk of the town. But before man came along and sought to harness this combustible energy, the Carboniferous coal-making process had an impact on the climate. The burial of so much organic carbon caused a dizzying drop in the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This drop in CO2 not only cools the climate, but also increases oxygen levels. Oxygen levels will have an impact on the development of insects, but we'll come back to that later. The erosion of high mountains increases. They are subject to heavy rainfall due to their geographical position, and they too draw in carbon dioxide. The combination of these phenomena, leading to a sharp drop in carbon dioxide, is conducive to the formation of an ice cap. Remember, we touched on this subject when we talked about the changing climate during the Carboniferous period. This ice cap formed mainly in southern Gondwana around 330 million years ago. This was the start of the Gondwanic glaciation, which continued through the Permian. You'll understand better now why we talk about coal forests, but also why they played a role in the cooling of certain areas of the planet. Now it's time to understand another tree-related phenomenon. We mentioned seeds earlier, but that's not the only revolution in trees. Let's see how deciduous leaves came about. The opulence of the vegetation colonizing the continent has the main effect of considerably lowering CO2 levels in the air, and by the same token, the planet's overall temperature. We've seen this regularly on our various time travels. An ecosystem is based on a delicate balance between a biotope, fauna, flora, climate, and environment. All these elements are interconnected, and each is ultimately dependent on the others. A change in temperature inevitably has an impact on all these elements, flora and fauna included. Such a major change can make some species more vulnerable, but it can also have a number of positive consequences. In temperate zones, for example, temperature differences will favor the development of deciduous trees. Trees need to adopt new aptitudes to continue colonizing the soil. They need to make better use of the sun's energy, save energy to survive temperature variations, and develop a more durable means of reproduction. Deciduous leaves thus make their grand entrance among arborescent plants, while the great coal forests stretch all the way to the equator. Leaves are not only less necessary for trees, they can also endanger them. Large quantities of water evaporate through the leaves every day. In temperate zones, certain climatic changes could lead to the loss of the tree. The trunk and branches are insulated by the bark, and the roots buried in the ground are sufficiently armed against this drop in temperature. But the leaves? They're on the front line and very greedy for water. To resist, the tree learns to get rid of the superfluous. Not only deciduous leaves, but also different modes of reproduction allow trees to grow widely across the continent. The newly formed forests were home to a wide variety of fauna. The first amniotes, or reptiles, animals such as Echinopeton, Archaeopteryx, or Hylonomus lyelli, live in the forest, but they share it with insects. Contrary to popular belief, these animals are not always the predators. In fact, they sometimes side with the giant insect's prey. As the forest grows and becomes so luxuriant and varied, insects benefit greatly from this new ecosystem. One of the great characteristics of the Carboniferous period was its giant insects. It's true that for our current way of thinking, to imagine for a single second that a millipede or dragonfly is close to a meter long seems totally implausible and even downright frightening. We're used to dealing with insects that are much smaller, sometimes even tiny or microscopic. Yet the Carboniferous is renowned for being the reign of giant insects. However, here again it's important to keep things in perspective if we want to get as close to reality as possible. While it's true that some Carboniferous insects were monstrously large, not all of them were. It's not a generality, an absolute rule among insects of this period. Many of them were just as small as we might imagine today. With that out of the way, let's dig a little deeper to understand the reasons for the unusual proportions of this particular animal group. Many scientists have tried to understand the causes of gigantism in these species. Why did they adopt such proportions? Several hypotheses have been put forward on the subject, but most of them are based on the significant increase in oxygen levels in the atmosphere. We have seen that the fall of the coal forests and the formation of coal led to a drop in carbon dioxide, but also to a sharp rise in oxygen levels. Michael S. Engel, a paleoentomologist specializing in insects at the University of Kansas, explains that insects don't have lungs, but rather small external orifices. These orifices, called stigmas, allow air to enter their bodies. It circulates through a network of tubes, the tracheae, to supply the organs with oxygen. This form of passive respiration is not very efficient, as oxygen diffusion is slower than if it were carried by the blood, as in vertebrates. The only way for giant arthropods to have enough oxygen to survive with such a respiratory system is for the air reaching their tracheae to be more oxygenated. This was the case in the Carboniferous, when the rate was 35% instead of 21% today. Insects trapped in amber are one of the means by which scientists have been able to determine this oxygen content. A number of experiments have been carried out to test this line of thought. Researchers led by Arizona State University paleobiologist John Vandenbrooks have grown very large dragonflies, rearing the insects from start to finish in environments similar to Earth's oxygen conditions millions of years ago. They turned out to be 15% larger than normal. To correlate these results, they also collected 11 other living fossils, such as beetles and cockroaches, in 3 habitats with different oxygen concentrations. Some had 31%, as in the Carboniferous, others 21%, as today, and still others 12%, as 240 million years ago. They discovered that dragonflies and beetles grew faster and larger in an oxygen-rich environment, while cockroaches grew more slowly and remained the same size. They also observed that all but 2 species of bugs became smaller than normal at lower oxygen concentrations. This probably explains why not all the insects were oversized at the time. With their respiratory systems, they adapt to the amount of oxygen they can take in. Coming back to insects in general, whether gigantic or ordinary-sized, it's hard to say today how many different species populated the Earth. Indeed, we have no precise idea of the current number. To date, around 1 million different species have been described, but it is estimated that there are probably 10 to 100 times that number, many of them found in the canopies of the great tropical forests, notably the Amazon rainforest. So there's still a lot we don't know, even today. In the Carboniferous, we know of certain species, but there is certainly a great deal that is unknown even then. Let's take a look at some of these giants. To inaugurate our encounter with Carboniferous insects, let's start with one of the most emblematic of the era, Meganeura moniae. This is the most famous giant dragonfly of the period. With a wingspan of over 70 centimeters or 28 inches, it weighed 150 grams. In other words, such an insect on your forearm would have the same wingspan as a hawk. Its abdomen, as you can see, is very elongated. It also has 4 large ribbed wings attached to its thorax. Its 6 jointed legs are covered with spines, no doubt to help it hang on to its victims. Dragonflies are predators, and this one is a fearsomely efficient one. Its eyesight is a major asset. It has a 360-degree view. Nothing escapes it. But it's not enough to have a good view of your victim. You also need to be reactive and powerful in order to seize it and give it no chance of regaining its freedom. Reactivity is provided by its wings and legs. Unlike our modern dragonflies, which do this while hovering, this one was able to attack in flight. Scientists have studied the fossil and hypothesized that it could reach a top speed of 70 kilometers per hour or 44 miles per hour. The power, however, lies in the head. Its mouth parts are designed for biting. She was never a picky eater, making do with whatever came her way. Cockroaches, bedbugs, cicadas, beetles, mosquitoes, wasps, termites, ants. Its diet was as varied as insect biodiversity could be in these lush Carboniferous forests. Here is a 20-centimeter or 8-inch cockroach that should make a perfect breakfast for our majestic Meganeura. In the same vein, but smaller, with a wingspan of 55 centimeters or 22 inches, we can also mention the Mazotheros, Haliodictyopteran. This one has 3 pairs of wings. Another animal, this time wingless, is as iconic of the period as Meganeura. It's a centipede, Arthropleura. 450 million years ago, centipedes, i.e. myriapods, a sub-branch of the arthropods and cousin of insects, began to emerge from the water. They were probably the first animals to settle permanently on continents, but they were probably not at first as impressive as the one that now awaits us. Over 2.5 meters, or 8 feet long, and around 50 centimeters, or 20 inches wide. And that's just the beginning. This centipede was as long as an alligator. Arthropleura's diet still poses questions for the scientific community. Traces of pollen were found in its abdomen, suggesting a herbivorous diet, but it also had 2 pincers and a very powerful jaw. Such tools suggest a carnivorous diet. Let's take a look at Megarachne, a spider. At least aesthetically it looks like one, even if recent studies have shown that scientists classify the animal as a eurypterid. This misclassification was based on certain characteristics, such as the shape of its carapace, the arrangement of its mouth parts, its circular belly, and its 15mm circular eyes, located between the other 2 eyes in the middle of its head. At first glance, this suggested that Megarachne was a spider, and not just any spider, the largest ever to have lived on Earth. Since then, the tools and techniques used to study fossils, as well as our knowledge of the past, have enabled us to analyze these animals from a different, more precise angle. Although this is certainly a eurypterid, its deceptive appearance has earned it the right to appear here, simply for the pleasure and fright that such an animal provides. With a length of 35 centimeters or 14 inches and a distance of 60 centimeters or 24 inches between the upper legs, it is without doubt the most impressive of all arachnids. With such proportions, it could cover a cat. In addition to its size, its predatory prowess is nothing to be ashamed of. She's perfectly equipped for the hunt, and will stop at nothing when the opportunity presents itself. The only relief is that Megarachne is no longer with us. Crossing paths with this type of animal is enough to make your hair stand on end and make you scream in horror. Let's end our tour of carboniferous arthropods and insects on a softer note, with the discovery in 2021 of Tenoptilus frequens. The Paris Natural History Museum has funded and coordinated a paleology research group. It was this study that brought Tenoptilus frequens to light. It has an abdominal appendage for depositing eggs. These animals are known as ovipositors. They also have 3 pairs of sword-shaped valves and 2 valve articulation systems. In other words, they have all the characteristics of Orthoptera. Analyses have enabled us to study the fossilized animal's abdomen in greater depth. We're talking here about a lobetid insect, i.e. of the locust, grasshopper, or cricket genus. These animals were already living on Earth in the Carboniferous period. The major difference between today's insect population and that of the past lies in the insect's growth phase. Back then, very few were part of the so-called metamorphosis insects, such as flies, bees, and beetles. Vegetation is one of the keys to this animal diversification. Alongside the classic ferns with sporangia-bearing leaves, there are ferns whose leaves bear seeds for the very first time. After the appearance of amniotic eggs, the seed enters the scene. So it seems that plants, too, are undergoing major revolutions. Numerous species, insects, but also synapsids, diapsids, and amphibians are taking advantage of this new, flourishing ecosystem and all the riches it has to offer. The expansion of all these species should not, however, obscure the change that is taking place in the forest at the end of the Carboniferous period. Indeed, with the end of coal formation comes the end of the Carboniferous, from which the period takes its name. One possible explanation for the end of charcoal production lies in the appearance of a new species of lignivorous or xylophagous fungi, capable of degrading all lignin thanks to enzymes known as lignin peroxidases. Their appearance ushered in a new era, the Permian. It too will have to meet certain challenges, but we'll see about that on our next trip.